Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. In the far reaches of the galaxy, on the very edge of human exploration, a star erupted in a violent burst of light and energy. The explosion was more than just a spectacular end to a celestial body, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The light that came from that dying star wasn't just a flash, it was a beam, sharp and precise, stretching out across the cosmos like a weapon aimed at the planet Eos, the lone colony in that forgotten corner of the galaxy. The colonists of Eos had seen distant stars die before, but never like this. Telescopes and sensors lit up with warnings, but no one understood the true nature of what was coming. When the light hit Eos, it didn't cause explosions or fires. No, it was much more insidious than that. The beam seemed to seep into everything, penetrating the atmosphere, crawling into the soil, sinking into the bones of every living thing on the planet. At first, nothing happened. Life continued as normal, though a sense of unease lingered in the air. It wasn't long before that sense of unease turned into terror. The first to notice something wrong were the researchers stationed in the wilds, those who studied the native creatures of Eos. Animals that had once been docile, barely a threat to the settlers, began to change. They grew larger, their eyes wild with aggression, their bodies twisting into grotesque new forms. The researchers sent out frantic messages back to the colony, but by the time help arrived, it was too late. All that remained of the research station were shattered buildings and bloodstains. In the colony itself, the effects of the beam were more subtle at first. The people began to feel a broken bar different. Fear, the natural survival instinct, began to fade. At first, they welcomed Ida, who wouldn't want to live without fear. But soon, the absence of fear turned into something much darker. With no fear, there was no hesitation, no second thoughts. Anger came easily, and with it, violence. The colonists, who had once worked together to build a future on this distant world, began to turn on each other. Elias Rook watched it all happen from a distance. He was a pilot, a man who spent more time in the sky than on the ground, ferrying supplies and colonists between the scattered outposts of Eos. Elias had always been a loner, someone who preferred the quiet solitude of his cockpit to the noise and chaos of colony life. So when the fighting started, when people began to lose their grip on sanity, he stayed in the air, watching from above. But even Elias couldn't ignore what was happening for long. The colony's leadership, what was left of it, put out desperate calls for help. They needed someone to find out what had caused this madness, someone to find a solution before the entire planet descended into chaos. Elias wasn't a hero, but he knew he couldn't just sit by and watch it all burn. So, reluctantly, he brought his ship, the Omen, down to the surface and began his search for answers. As he wandered through the colony, now little more than a battleground, Elias saw the full extent of the damage. Buildings lay in ruins, fires burned uncontrolled, and bodies littered the streets. The survivors weren't much better off. Those who hadn't been killed were either hiding in fear or had given into the madness, roaming the streets in packs, attacking anyone who crossed their path. Elias knew he needed to act fast. The light of the eye of the stars, as some had begun to call Ida, was still affecting them. He could feel it too, that strange calm in his mind where fear should be. It was like a numbness, an absence of something that should be there, a feeling he couldn't shake. But Elias was no stranger to fear, and he knew the dangers of a mind without it. Fear kept you alive, kept you thinking. Without it, all that was left was impulse. And impulse, unchecked, was deadly. He made his way to the central command center, hoping to find some information, some clue as to what had happened. The command center was barely operational, its systems flickering as if even the machines were affected by the strange light. The few officers who remained were a shell of their former selves, their eyes hollow, their movements mechanical. Elias didn't waste time with them. He dug into the systems himself, scanning through reports, data logs, anything that might give him a lead. That's when he found it. Buried deep in the files was a transmission, fragmented and garbled, but still clear enough to understand. It was a message from a nearby outpost, sent just before the light had hit us. The message spoke of an alien structure, ancient and vast, hidden beneath the surface of the planet. The researchers there had activated something they didn't understand. And then the light came. Elias knew what he had to do. The answers were beneath the surface, in that alien structure. Whatever the researchers had found, whatever they had unleashed, it was the key to everything. He just hoped he wasn't too late. He took the Omen back into the sky, heading toward the coordinates of the outpost. The journey was perilous. The mutated creatures that now roamed the planet weren't confined to the ground. Flying beasts, massive and terrifying, had begun to appear, their forms twisted and alien. Elias had to use every bit of his skill to navigate the skies, dodging their attacks as he raced toward his destination. When he finally arrived at the outpost, he found it in ruins. The alien structure, however, was still intact. It loomed over the wreckage, a massive monolith of dark stone, its surface covered in strange, glowing symbols. Elias felt a chill run down his spine as he approached it. This was the source. This was where it had all begun. The entrance to the structure was open, as if waiting for him. Elias stepped inside, his footsteps echoing through the vast, empty halls. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and the walls seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. The deeper he went, the stronger the feeling became, until it was almost suffocating. Finally, he reached the heart of the structure. In the center of the room was a massive device, unlike anything Elias had ever seen. It was ancient, clearly alien, its design incomprehensible to human eyes. But one thing was clear. This was the source of the Eye of the Stars. This was what had caused the madness on Yas. Elias approached the device cautiously, unsure of what to do next. He wasn't a scientist or an engineer. He was just a pilot, and this was far beyond anything he had ever dealt with. But he knew he had to stop it. The people of Yas were counting on him, even if they didn't know it. As he studied the device, he noticed something strange. The glowing symbols on its surface weren't random. They were shifting, changing, as if responding to his presence. And then, without warning, a voice filled the room. "You have come." Elias froze. The voice was deep, resonant, and unmistakably alien. It spoke directly into his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. "You have been chosen to face the trial of the stars." Elias's heart raced. The trial of the stars? What did that mean? "Your species has been found wanting." The voice continued, emotionless and cold. It spoke of an ancient civilization, one that had long since disappeared but had left behind its legacy in the form of this trial. The Eye of the Stars was a test, designed to judge the worthiness of a species. Those who could resist the madness, who could retain their humanity in the face of fearlessness, would be deemed worthy. Those who failed a broken bar would be destroyed. Elias's mind raced as he processed the information. This wasn't just an accident. The Eye of the Stars was deliberate, a tool of judgment. And humanity had failed. The voice spoke again, softer this time, almost as if it were contemplating. "But you are different. You have resisted the pull of the Eye. You have retained your mind. Perhaps your broken bar there is hope." Elias felt a surge of determination. He wasn't about to let some long-dead alien race decide the fate of humanity. If there was a chance to stop this, to save what was left of Yas, he had to take it. He moved toward the device, his mind focused on one thing, shutting it down. But as he reached for it, the symbols on the surface flared to life, and the room was filled with blinding light. Elias squinted against the sudden brightness, his instincts telling him to retreat, but something in the alien structure held him in place. The light wasn't painful, it enveloped him, seeping into his mind, filling his thoughts with images and sensations beyond anything he'd ever experienced. He could see the stars, not as distant points of light but as vast, living entities, each with a purpose, each connected to something far greater than himself. It was as if the universe itself had opened up before him, and for a fleeting moment, He felt a strange sense of peace. But just as quickly as it came, the peace was shattered. The light dimmed, and Elias found himself standing in the heart of the alien structure once again, the device humming softly in the background. His mind was clear now, focused. The voice that had spoken to him was gone, but its message remained. He had to stop the eye, or what was left of humanity on Eos would be lost. Elias examined the device with newfound purpose. He could see now that the symbols on its surface weren't just random markings, they were part of a complex interface, one designed to interact directly with the mind. He wasn't an expert in alien technology, but he had no other choice. Taking a deep breath, he placed his hand on the device and let his thoughts flow into it. The response was immediate. The symbols flared to life once more, shifting and rearranging themselves into a pattern Elias could almost understand. It was as if the device was communicating with him, not in words, but in pure thought. Images of the star that had exploded, of the beam of light that had struck Eos, and of the countless other worlds that had faced the same trial flashed through his mind. He saw species rise and fall, civilizations crumble under the weight of their own fearlessness, all because they couldn't pass the test. But there was something else, a faint glimmer of hope, buried deep within the patterns of light and energy. The trial could be stopped, the damage reversed, but only if Elias could figure out how to control the device. His mind raced as he sifted through the images, searching for a solution. The device was designed to test a species' ability to resist the pull of the eye, to retain their humanity in the face of overwhelming fearlessness. Elias had done that. He hadn't succumbed to the madness like the others. He had fought it, held on to his mind, his purpose. Maybe that was the key. He focused his thoughts on that idea, willing the device to respond. The symbols on its surface pulsed in time with his thoughts, and slowly, the room around him began to change. The walls shifted, revealing a control panel hidden beneath layers of alien technology. It was ancient, but it was still operational, still capable of turning off the eye. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the panel. This was it. The fate of Eos rested in his hands. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the controls, when a sudden jolt of fear shot through him. He hesitated. What if he was wrong? What if turning off the device only made things worse? The voice had said that the trial was a test of worthiness. If he stopped it now, would humanity still be judged? Would they be deemed unworthy and destroyed? His mind raced, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. But then he thought of the colony, of the people who were still alive, still fighting to survive. He couldn't let them suffer any longer. He couldn't let the eye of the stars take everything from them. With a steady hand, Elias activated the panel. The symbols on the device flared one last time, then began to fade, their light dimming until they were nothing more than faint etchings on the surface. The hum of energy that had filled the room since his arrival faded into silence. It was over. Elias stood there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for something to happen. But there was only silence. The device was off. The trial had ended. He turned and made his way back to the Omen, his steps slow and deliberate. Outside, the sky was calm. The creatures that had mutated in the wake of the eye's light were still there, but they were different now, less aggressive, less dangerous. The colonists, too, were starting to come back to themselves. The violence that had gripped them was fading, replaced by confusion and exhaustion. Elias climbed into his ship and took off, the familiar hum of the engines a welcome sound after the chaos of the past few days. He flew over the colony, watching as the people began to emerge from their hiding places, unsure of what had happened but grateful that the madness had stopped. As he soared through the sky, Elias couldn't help but think about the trial. The eye of the stars had judged humanity, but had they passed? He had stopped the device, saved the colony, but what did that mean for the future? The voice had said that the trial was a test of worthiness, a test to see if a species could retain their humanity in the face of fearlessness. Elias had held on to his, but what about the others? The weight of that question lingered with him as he left Eos behind, heading back toward the outer rim of the galaxy. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: humanity had been tested, and they had survived. Whether or not they had passed the trial was a question for another time. For now, Elias was content to fly, the stars stretching out before him like a promise of something more, something better. The eye of the stars might have been closed, but the universe was still vast, still full of mysteries to uncover. And Elias Rook would be there to face them, whatever they might be. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The planet loomed in the view screen, a swirling mass of emerald greens and sapphire blues, untouched by human hands. Captain James Harlow sat in his command chair, his eyes fixed on the image of the distant world as the rest of the crew bustled around him, making final preparations for their landing. The ship hummed with the familiar sounds of engines adjusting for descent, but beneath the routine, there was an undercurrent of tension, as something they all felt but no one spoke aloud. It had been months of travel through the cold reaches of space, chasing after a signal that no one could quite explain. It had appeared out of nowhere, a subtle, almost subconscious pulse in their navigation system, beckoning them toward this distant, uncharted planet. The mission was simple on the surface: make contact with whatever sent the signal, assess the situation, and report back to Earth Command. But nothing was ever that simple, and Harlow had a gnawing suspicion that whatever waited for them down there wasn't going to make this mission an easy one. Final approach in 30 seconds, came the voice of Lieutenant Carl Weber, his steady tone masking the same unease that Harlow felt. Weber was dependable, a solid soldier, and Harlow's right-hand man. If he was feeling the pressure, he wasn't showing it. Harlow glanced over at Dr. Ilara Monroe, their lead scientist, who sat at her station reviewing data from the planet. Her brow was furrowed, lips pursed in concentration as she scanned the readings, searching for any anomalies. "Anything new on the scans?" Harlow asked, breaking the silence. Monroe shook her head. "Nothing out of the ordinary. Oxygen levels are high. Breathable atmosphere. It's almost too perfect. No signs of civilization, no visible structure as just endless forest and oceans. Whatever sent that signal isn't showing itself yet." Harlow nodded, not surprised by the lack of clarity. He had a feeling they wouldn't get any answers until they were on the ground. He stood up, adjusting his uniform as the ship began to tremble slightly with the descent. "Gear up, everyone. We're about to make history." The landing was smoother than anticipated. The ship settled on a soft patch of ground near the edge of a massive forest, the trees towering like ancient sentinels. The air outside shimmered with a strange, almost magical quality, as if the atmosphere itself was alive with potential. Harlow stepped out first, the crunch of the soil under his boots sending a shiver of excitement through him. It had been years since he'd set foot on an unexplored world, and despite his reservations, there was still something exhilarating about it. He took a deep breath. That the air was crisp, clean, almost sweet. The rest of the team followed, spreading out to establish a perimeter. Dr. Monroe scanned the area, her handheld device beeping rhythmically as it collected data. Weber stood close to Harlow, his hand resting on the butt of his blaster, his eyes scanning the tree line for any signs of movement. "So where's our welcoming committee?" Weber asked, his voice tinged with sarcasm, as if in response. The air shimmered again, and suddenly, they weren't alone. From the trees emerged a group of beings, unlike anything Harlow had ever seen. They floated just above the ground, their translucent bodies glowing with an inner light, their forms shifting and undulating like water. They were beautiful in a strange, otherworldly way, alien, yet somehow familiar. "Captain Harlow," came a voice, though it wasn't spoken aloud. It echoed in his mind, soft and melodic, like a dream. The lead figure, slightly larger than the others, floated forward. "We are the ally." Harlow swallowed, composing himself. "I'm Captain James Harlow of the United Earth Federation. We received your signal and came to establish contact." The ally leader's form pulsed with light. "You have come far, seeking knowledge, power, and understanding. We offer you a pact, a bond of mutual benefit. We can enhance your abilities, push your species beyond its limits. Together, we can achieve greatness. Harlow felt the pull of their words, the promise of something greater than himself, greater than humanity. But he wasn't a fool. What exactly are you offering, and what do you expect in return? The Zali's form flickered. A symbiosis. We will merge with your kind, share our knowledge and strength. In return, we ask only for your trust, for you to allow us to guide you to your full potential. Harlow glanced at Monroe, who was staring at the Zali with a mixture of awe and suspicion. We'll need time to consider your offer, he said carefully. This isn't a decision we can make lightly. The Zali leader's voice echoed in his mind once more. Take the time you need, Captain Harlow. But know this, without us, you will never reach the heights you're capable of. We are your key to the future. With that, the Zali faded back into the forest, leaving the team alone once more. That night, the team gathered around the small campfire they'd set up outside the ship. The flames crackled softly, casting long shadows over their faces as they discussed the day's events. This is insane, Weber said, shaking his head. We can't trust those things. They're playing us. I can feel it. Dr. Monroe was more measured in her response. They didn't give us any reason to distrust them. If what they're saying is true, we could gain a lot from this. Think of the technological advances we could make, the medical breakthroughs. They're offering us the chance to evolve. Harlow stared into the fire, his mind racing. He understood both perspectives. Weber's skepticism was well-founded, but Monroe's argument was compelling. If the Zali were telling the truth, this could be the opportunity of a lifetime. We need more information, he said finally. Monroe, I want you to run some more scans, see if we can learn anything about these creatures that we didn't pick up before. Weber, keep the perimeter secure. We can't afford to let our guard down. As the night wore on, Harlow found himself unable to sleep. The Zali's words echoed in his mind, their offer tantalizing and dangerous. What would it mean to merge with them? Would they really enhance his abilities, make him stronger, faster, smarter? Or would they take something from him, something he couldn't afford to lose? He stepped away from the camp, the soft hum of the ship behind him as he walked toward the edge of the forest. The trees loomed above, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The air felt different here, heavier, charged with a strange energy. Suddenly, the Zali appeared before him, their forms shimmering in the moonlight. You hesitate, Captain Harlow, the leader said, its voice soft in his mind. Do you fear the unknown? Harlow clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain calm. I fear making the wrong choice. There is no wrong choice, the Zali said. Only fear and hesitation. We offer you the future. All you need to do is accept. For a moment, Harlow was tempted. He could feel the power radiating from the Zali, could sense the possibilities they offered. But something deep inside him, some primal instinct, held him back. There was more to this than the Zali were telling them. I'll need more time, Harlow said, stepping back. The Zali's light flickered, their form shifting slightly. Time is an illusion, Captain. You will soon see that we are inevitable. With that, the Zali vanished, leaving Harlow alone in the darkness. The next day, the team gathered again, and Monroe had her results. There's something strange about their biology, she said, showing Harlow and Weber her findings. They're not just symbiotic, they're parasitic. I think they've done this before, on other species. They lured them in with promises of power, but once the bond is made, it's irreversible. They take control. Harlow's heart sank. He had known, deep down, that something wasn't right. Now they had proof. Weber cursed under his breath. We need to get out of here, now. But it wasn't going to be that easy. Before they could move, the Zali returned, this time with more urgency in their glowing forms. You have discovered our nature, the leader said, its voice cold now, devoid of the warmth it had shown before. But it is too late. The bond has already begun. Monroe gasped, clutching her head as a searing pain shot through her mind. Harlow felt it too, a sharp, invasive pressure, as if something was pushing into his brain, twisting his thoughts, making him doubt his own will. "We are one now," the Zali said, their voices merging into a chorus. "You will become more than you ever imagined, but you will also become ours." The pain rippled through Harlow's skull like a wave crashing against rock. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he felt himself slipping away, his thoughts no longer his own. The Zali's voices echoed in his mind, melding with his own thoughts until he couldn't tell where he ended and they began. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay grounded, to fight the intrusion. He looked over at Monroe, whose face had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. She was clutching her head, trying to resist the same invasive presence, but it was clear she was losing the battle. "We have door broken bar, we have to fight them," Harlow managed, his voice strained. He reached out and grabbed her shoulder, trying to anchor both of them to reality. But the pressure only increased, like invisible hands squeezing his brain. Weber was already on his feet, blaster in hand, eyes darting toward the Zali forms, now hovering ominously above them. "Captain, what the hell do we do? These things are inside us." Harlow's mind raced, struggling to form a coherent thought amidst the noise the Zali were creating in his head. He had to get control. He had to act. He pushed the pain down, focusing on the mission. "We need to break their hold." "Monroe, is there any way to disrupt this bond?" Monroe blinked, her eyes flickering with the briefest moment of clarity as she processed his question. "Maybe broken bar, maybe there's a way to overload the connection," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "But we'd need a strong enough energy source, something to destabilize the link between them and us." Weber, still holding his blaster tightly, looked around. "What about the ship's core?" "That thing's powerful enough to blow this whole forest to hell." Harlow grimaced. That was an option, but the risks were astronomical. If they failed to control the blast, they'd all be dead or worse, completely absorbed by the Zali. But there wasn't time to weigh the alternatives. The longer they waited, the stronger the alien presence became, pushing deeper into their minds, making them doubt their every move. "It's our only shot," Harlow said. "We head back to the ship, set the core to overload, and use it to fry these bastards out of our heads." Monroe nodded, though her face was still tight with pain. "We'll need to time it perfectly. Too early, and the Zali might be able to stop us. Too late, and a broken bar, well, we won't have to worry about it." Harlow steadied himself, his vision clearing slightly as he focused on the plan. "Weber, cover us. We're moving." They started toward the ship, their movements sluggish at first, as if fighting through thick mud. The Zali's influence clung to them, pulling them back, trying to assert control over their limbs, their minds. But Harlow forced himself forward, one step at a time, with Monroe and Weber right behind him. As they neared the ship, the Zali leader's voice boomed inside Harlow's head, louder and more menacing than before. "You cannot escape us, Captain. The bond is eternal. You're ours." Harlow gritted his teeth, pushing the voice aside. "Not today." They reached the ship's entrance, the heavy door sliding open with a hiss. Inside, the familiar hum of the systems offered a brief moment of comfort, but there was no time to rest. Harlow and Monroe rushed toward the engine room, while Weber stayed by the entrance, his blaster ready, eyes scanning the tree line for any signs of the Zali's physical presence. Monroe immediately went to work, her fingers flying across the control panel as she began the process of overloading the core. Beads of sweat formed on her brow as she concentrated, the strain of the alien presence still weighing on her. "This is going to take a few minutes," she said, her voice tight. "I need you to buy me some time." Harlow nodded, gripping his blaster. "We'll hold them off." Outside, the sky darkened. The Zali had begun to coalesce, their glowing forms shifting and multiplying as they swarmed toward the ship. Weber fired several warning shots, but the Zali didn't flinch. They were relentless, driven by a single purpose, yet to complete the bond, to fully control their new hosts. "Captain," Weber shouted, backing up as his ally drew closer. "They're coming fast." Harlow joined him at the entrance, firing into the massive light and energy. The blasts seemed to have little effect, merely dispersing the aliens for a moment before they reformed and continued their advance. They were unlike any enemy Harlow had ever faced, untouchable, unstoppable. "Weber, we can't let them get inside," Harlow yelled over the din of the blaster fire. Weber nodded grimly, but it was clear that both of them knew it was only a matter of time before the Zali breached the ship. Their bodies might still be human, but their minds were being ripped apart from the inside. Then, with a sudden pulse, the Zali stopped. They hovered just outside the ship, their forms flickering with an unnatural intensity. For a moment, everything was still. "What the hell?" a broken bar, Weber whispered, his blaster still trained on the aliens. Harlow's stomach dropped. This was wrong. Too easy. "Monroe, how much time do you need?" "Almost there," she called back, her voice frantic. "Just hold on a little longer." The Zali leader's voice echoed through the air, filling the space around them. "You fight for nothing, Captain. The symbiosis is complete. You cannot win." Harlow's vision blurred again, the invasive presence in his mind growing stronger, more insistent. He fought against it with everything he had, but it was like trying to swim against a tidal wave. His arms felt heavy, his thoughts slipping out of his grasp. Beside him, Weber collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. "A broken bar. I can't a broken bar, Captain. I can't a broken bar." The Zali were winning. The bond was almost complete. Harlow staggered, barely able to stay on his feet as the world around him seemed to fade. The ship, the forest, Weber's voice, it all seemed distant, like a fading dream. Then, just as his vision went black, there was a flash of light. A deafening roar filled his ears, followed by a surge of heat that knocked him off his feet. The core had overloaded. For a moment, there was nothing but blinding light and searing pain. Harlow's body felt like it was being torn apart, every nerve screaming in agony. He couldn't think, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. Harlow lay on the ground, gasping for air, his mind reeling. He was still alive. Somehow, against all odds, he had survived. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet, his body aching with every movement. Around him, the ship's interior was a wreck. Smoke billowed from the ruined control panels, and sparks flew from exposed wires. But the Zali were gone. Their presence in his mind, the constant pressure, it was all gone. He turned to see Weber, still slumped on the ground, but breathing. Monroe was lying against the wall, her eyes open, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. "We broken bar, did it?" Harlow croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. Monroe nodded weakly. "We overloaded the link." "It worked." Harlow closed his eyes, relief washing over him like a wave. They had broken free. The Zali were defeated, but the victory was hollow. As Harlow looked around at the wreckage of the ship, at his exhausted and battered team, he knew that they had barely escaped. The Zali might be gone, but the scars they left, both physical and mental, would never fade. "We need to warn Earth," Monroe said softly, her voice shaky. "The Zali, a broken bar, they're still out there. This wasn't the first time they've tried this. It won't be the last." Harlow nodded, though the thought of facing the Zali again made his stomach churn. "We will," he said, his voice resolute. "We'll make sure everyone knows what they're up against." As the remaining team members gathered their strength and began the long process of repairing the ship, Harlow couldn't shake the feeling that they had only delayed the inevitable. The Zali were far from finished. They had survived this encounter, but the next time, a broken bar, the next time might be different. For now, though, they had won, and that was enough. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The dim lights of cell 314 flickered overhead, casting long, restless shadows on the metallic walls. Arden Voss, slumped against the cold corner, absently traced the scars on his arm, the marks of a life that no longer belonged to him. The silence of the prison was its own form of torture, a reminder that time here didn't just pass, it weighed down, suffocating the soul. There was no escape from it. Not the walls, not the guards, and not even in sleep. His dreams had always been his sanctuary. Even when he'd been out there, running jobs across the system, dodging bounty hunters and Federation enforcers, sleep was a safe haven. It was the one place no one could touch him, where the ghosts of his past couldn't reach. Until now. The nightmares had started a week ago. At first, they were just unsettling. Flashes of memories distorted of people he'd known, faces twisted, voices garbled like broken transmissions. But then they grew worse, sharper, more real. His body ached when he woke, and the exhaustion gnawed at him like a sickness. Something was wrong, and he knew it wasn't just in his head. It wasn't until last night, when he found himself running endlessly down a corridor that looped in on itself, that he realized he wasn't alone in the dream. There was something with him. He couldn't see it, not clearly, but he could feel it, watching, waiting, and hunting. Arden sat up, wiping the sweat from his brow. The thin fabric of his prison uniform clung to his skin, damp and cold. His breath hitched as his gaze darted toward the cell door. He wasn't sure why. The guards rarely came this deep into the solitary wing, and the other inmates had long since stopped making noise. But something felt off. The lights flickered again, and for a split second, the room seemed to stretch, elongate in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Arden blinked hard, trying to shake off the lingering remnants of the nightmare. Then, he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, he thought it was coming from the ventilation shaft above him, just another mechanical malfunction in this rusting heap of a prison. But the sound was too deliberate, too personal. It echoed in his mind, not his ears. It wasn't a sound, it was a presence. "Who's there?" Arden's voice cracked, more out of fear than curiosity. The whisper didn't answer, but it lingered, circling him like a predator studying its prey. He could feel its intent, probing the edges of his consciousness, slipping in through cracks he didn't even know were there. His vision blurred for a moment, the walls around him warping as though they were made of liquid, bending and twisting. He shut his eyes tight, but the images persisted. His hands gripped the edge of his cot as his heartbeat quickened. His mind was no longer his own. Something else had taken hold. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the sensation vanished. The room snapped back to its grim, metallic reality. But Arden was left with a hollow feeling in the pit of his stomach, like a piece of him had been torn away. For the rest of the night, sleep didn't come. The next day, Arden paced the length of his cell, his mind buzzing with questions he couldn't answer. No one else seemed to be affected. When the guards came to bring his meal, their expressions were as vacant as always, mechanical in their routines. The other prisoners were silent, resigned to their fates. But Arden could feel it, simmering beneath the surface, something dark, something hungry. It was watching him. And then, it happened again. This time, it wasn't subtle. As soon as he closed his eyes, he was pulled into the nightmare world, the lines between dream and reality blurring almost instantly. Arden stood on a vast, barren plain, the sky above him a swirl of dark clouds, churning like an angry sea. In the distance, he could see figures, distorted, shadowed shapes moving toward him, their forms shifting and merging like a mirage. He tried to move, but his feet felt glued to the ground. Panic surged through him, but no matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't break free. The whispers returned, louder now, clearer. They weren't words exactly, but more like thoughts, alien, incomprehensible, but insistent. They pressed against his mind, invading his thoughts, twisting them, until he could barely remember who he was or why he was here. And then, he saw it. The Reaper. It wasn't like anything he had ever seen before. Its form was fluid, constantly shifting between shapes, one moment humanoid, the next a mass of writhing tendrils. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was featureless, a blank void that seemed to suck in all the light around it. But at its eyes were everywhere, watching him, piercing through his soul, feeding on his fear. The Reaper moved closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Arden could feel his mind slipping, the last vestiges of his sanity crumbling under the weight of the creature's influence. He tried to fight, to push it away, but it was too strong. The Reaper reached out, and as its hand or passed for a hand that touched his chest, Arden felt a searing pain unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't physical, but something deeper, something that tore at the very essence of his being. His vision blurred, the world around him spinning out of control. And then, everything went black. When Arden woke, he was back in his cell, drenched in sweat, his body trembling uncontrollably. The pain lingered, a dull throb in the back of his mind. But more than that, he felt empty. Like something had been taken from him, something vital. He struggled to his feet, his legs shaky beneath him. His thoughts were a jumble, fragmented memories of the dream, or was it a dream? Flashing through his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that what he had experienced was real, that the Reaper wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was here, in the prison, and it wasn't going to stop until it had devoured him completely. Over the next few days, Arden became obsessed with finding answers. He spent hours scouring the prison's limited database, searching for any mention of the Soul Reapers. But there was nothing. No records, no reports, nothing that could explain what he was experiencing. It was as if the creature didn't exist. But Arden knew better. He could feel it, lurking in the shadows of his mind, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. It was during one of his restless searches that he stumbled upon Lyra, a fellow prisoner housed just a few cells down from his. She was a scientist, or at least she had been, before she'd been sent to this forsaken place. Like Arden, she had been having the same nightmares, the same encounters with the Reaper. At first, she was reluctant to talk, her eyes hollowed by weeks and maybe months of torment. But when she realized Arden was serious, that he had seen the Reaper too, she opened up. "It feeds on us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It traps us in our own minds, forces us to relive our worst memories, our greatest fears. And the more we suffer, the stronger it becomes." Arden nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from someone else made it all the more real. "But why?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "What does it want?" Lyra's gaze dropped to the floor, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know. I've been trying to figure that out, but..." She trailed off, her eyes glazing over as if she was lost in her own thoughts. Arden reached out, placing a hand on her arm. "Hey, we'll figure it out together." For the first time since he had met her, Lyra smiled, a small, sad smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I hope so." Over the next few days, they worked together, piecing together the fragments of their dreams, trying to find a way to fight back against the Reaper. They experimented with lucid dreaming techniques, attempting to take control of their nightmares, to turn the tables on the creature that had been hunting them. It wasn't easy. Every time they tried to resist, the Reaper would retaliate, its attacks becoming more intense, more painful. But slowly, they began to make progress. They learned to manipulate the dream world, bending it to their will, creating weapons and defenses that they could use against the Reaper. But the Reaper wasn't going to go down without a fight. As their battles with the Reaper became more frequent, Arden could feel the toll it was taking on his body and mind. His movements became sluggish, and the lines between the waking world and the nightmare realm blurred with every passing day. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going, but giving up wasn't an option. Not now. Lyra had grown stronger, too. Where once she had been hollowed out by fear, she now moved with a purpose, her sharp mind calculating every advantage they could take within the dream world. Together, they had devised traps and strategies, exploiting the Reaper's overconfidence in its ability to manipulate them. Arden could see it now. The creature was powerful, yes, but it had become so reliant on its prey sphere that it had grown predictable. The next time it appeared, they were ready. The nightmare world sprang into existence as Arden closed his eyes, the familiar twisted landscape of barren plains stretching out before him. He felt the usual disorientation as space distorted around him, but this time, he forced himself to stay focused. He knew it was coming. The Reaper emerged from the mist, its shifting, amorphous form gliding toward them, those piercing, all-seeing eyes gleaming in the darkness. Arden could feel its hunger, its anticipation of their terror. It was confident, as always, that they would break. But not this time. Lyra appeared beside him, her expression cold and resolute. She raised her hand, and the ground beneath them rippled in response, bending to her will. They had practiced these at turning the nightmare into their weapon. As the Reaper advanced, the terrain shifted beneath it, slowing its movements, destabilizing the illusion of its control. Arden gripped the hilt of a sword he had manifested, its gleaming blade humming with power. It wasn't real, of course, but in the dream world, it might as well have been. He moved forward, feeling the weight of the weapon in his hand, his heartbeat steady as he closed the distance between himself and the creature. The Reaper hesitated. It wasn't used to resistance, wasn't accustomed to its prey fighting back. For a moment, it seemed almost confused. But then, it lashed out, a tendril of darkness shooting toward Arden with blinding speed. He was ready. Arden sidestepped the attack, the blade in his hand slicing through the tendril as if it were nothing but mist. The Reaper recoiled, and Arden pressed the advantage, driving it back with a flurry of strikes. Each swing of his sword felt more real than the last, as though he were shaping the dream world around him, making it his own. Beside him, Lyra manipulated the landscape, creating walls of shifting sand and stone to corral the Reaper, trapping it within the confines of their shared nightmare. The creature twisted and writhed, its form flickering as it struggled to maintain control. For the first time, Arden saw fear in its eyes. The Reaper lashed out again, more desperately this time, but its attacks were wild, unfocused. Arden ducked beneath a sweeping tendril, his sword flashing as he struck at the heart of the creature. The Reaper howled, a sound that reverberated through the entire nightmare world, shaking the ground beneath them. And then, it changed. The Reaper's form shifted violently, its body warping and expanding, growing into something far larger, far more grotesque than before. Its eyes multiplied, swirling around its massive frame, and its tendrils stretched out like a sea of darkness, reaching toward them from every direction. Arden felt a surge of panic rise in his chest, but he pushed it down. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and steady. "Stay with me, Arden. Don't let it take control." He nodded, tightening his grip on the sword as the Reaper lunged toward them. They had to end this now. With a final push of his will, Arden drove forward, his blade cutting through the creature's defenses, slashing through the dark tendrils that reached for him. The Reaper's howl grew louder, more frantic, and Arden could feel its control slipping. The nightmare world trembled around them, the ground beneath their feet cracking and splintering as the Reaper's power faltered. Lyra raised her hands, channeling her will into the dream, and the ground beneath the Reaper's massive form split open, creating a chasm that swallowed the creature whole. It screamed as it fell, its eyes flickering out one by one as its body was consumed by the darkness. And then, silence. The nightmare world dissolved around them, fading into nothingness, and Arden found himself back in his cell, the cold metal floor pressing against his skin. His body ached, his mind felt raw, but he was alive. More importantly, he was free. Lyra sat across from him, breathing heavily, her face pale but victorious. "We did it," she whispered, a hint of disbelief in her voice. "It's gone." Arden nodded, though part of him still couldn't believe it. After all the torment, all the nightmares, it was finally over. The Reaper was gone. But even as the relief washed over him, there was a lingering sense of unease. He had learned something during the final battle, something the Reaper had inadvertently revealed in its last moments. It wasn't the only one. As the days passed, Arden and Lyra adjusted to life without the constant threat of the Reaper hanging over them. The other prisoners, oblivious to the danger they had been in, continued their routines, unaware of the creature that had been feeding on their minds. But Arden couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He had seen the Reaper's world, glimpsed its origins in those fragmented visions. There were more of them, scattered across the galaxy, hunting, feeding. And now that he had defeated one, he knew they would come for him. Arden wasn't a hero. He had never pretended to be. But something had changed in him during his time in the nightmare world. He had faced his worst fears, confronted the darkest parts of himself, and come out the other side stronger for it. He couldn't go back to being the man he was before. As he sat in his cell, staring out through the narrow window at the dying star beyond, he made a decision. He wouldn't wait for the next Reaper to find him, he would go to them. Lyra had her own path to follow. She had been through just as much as he had, maybe more, and she deserved a chance to live her life without the shadow of these creatures looming over her. But Arden wasn't done yet. He stood, stretching his tired muscles, and took one last look at the cell that had been his prison for so long. The door slid open with a hiss, and he stepped out into the corridor, the cold air biting at his skin. The prison was vast, sprawling across the surface of a barren moon, but Arden knew its layout like the back of his hand. He had spent years studying every detail, every exit, every potential escape route. And now, he was finally putting that knowledge to use. As he made his way toward the main control room, his mind was already racing ahead, thinking of the possibilities. The galaxy was vast, filled with more dangers than he could count, but Arden was ready. The Soul Reapers had shown him the worst they had to offer, and he had survived. Now, it was his turn to hunt them. He reached the control room, bypassing the security systems with ease. The guards had grown complacent over the years, and Arden had always been good at finding the cracks in any system. Within minutes, he had accessed the prison's communication array, sending out a signal to a ship he had stashed away years ago, hidden in the asteroid belt just beyond the moon's orbit. The ship responded almost immediately, its engines powering up as it began its journey toward the prison. Arden felt a flicker of satisfaction. It wouldn't be long now. As he waited, he glanced at the surveillance monitors, watching the other prisoners go about their lives, oblivious to the fact that one of their own was about to disappear. He thought about saying goodbye to Lyra, but he knew she wouldn't want that. They had fought together, survived together, but their paths had always been separate. The ship arrived without fanfare, docking at one of the remote hangars on the far side of the prison. Arden slipped through the corridors unnoticed, his footsteps silent as he made his way to the hangar bay. When he finally stepped aboard the ship, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. This was freedom. Not the kind he had imagined all those years ago when he was running jobs across the system, but something deeper, something more real. As the ship lifted off, leaving the prison and the dying star behind, Arden set a course for the outer rim of the galaxy. That was where the Reapers had come from. That was where they waited. And Arden was coming for them. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The planet was barren, a windswept desert of red rocks and towering cliffs that stretched far into the horizon. For days, Dr. Elena Roth had been scanning the landscape, her eyes flicking between the jagged formations and the readings on her tablet. A discovery of this magnitude wasn't something to take lightly, and she knew the consequences of rushing in. But as the team descended into the valley below, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly what they had been searching for, a breakthrough that could change everything. "We're close," Elena muttered, her fingers brushing the edge of the ancient inscription carved into the stone beneath her feet. Her breath caught in her throat. The alien language had been dead for millennia, but through painstaking research, she had cracked enough of it to understand what they had found: the catastrophe prison. "Roth, you sure about this?" Commander Holt's voice cut through her thoughts. He stood beside her, his bulk imposing even in the thinning air of the planet. His brow furrowed, eyes scanning the ruins with skepticism. "We don't even know what we're dealing with here." Elena turned to face him, her resolve hardening. "This is it. The inscriptions are clear. Something incredible is locked away here. If we can figure out what, it could lead to a major scientific breakthrough. We have to push forward." Holt sighed, glancing at the rest of the team assembling the equipment. Engineers, scientists, and a handful of soldiers, all part of the expedition, working tirelessly to uncover the mysteries of this forsaken world. He wasn't one to dismiss science, but something about this place set his teeth on edge. Jacob, one of the lead engineers, approached, wiping sweat from his brow. "We've got the equipment set up, Doc. We're ready to crack this thing open." "Good," Elena replied, stepping closer to the massive stone door that stood embedded into the rock. It was ancient, covered in dust and grime, with strange symbols etched across its surface. Her hand hovered over the control panel they had attached to it. "Let's begin." The machine hummed to life, lights flickering as it began scanning the structure. The ground beneath them trembled slightly, sending a shiver down Elena's spine. She shot a glance at Holt, but he remained stoic, his hand resting near his sidearm, a habit more than anything. No one expected trouble from a ruin this old. Then the door shifted, a low grinding noise filled the air, metal scraping against stone. The massive slab began to part, revealing a dark, yawning void beyond. The team held their breath, waiting. Elena stepped forward cautiously, peering into the darkness. Her heart raced, excitement and fear swirling inside her. Beyond the door, the air was thick, oppressive. A strange sensation washed over her, as if the very fabric of reality was bending around them. She blinked, her vision momentarily distorting, but then it cleared. A deep, cavernous chamber lay before them, filled with ancient technology and what appeared to be containment units. "Okay," Elena whispered, stepping into the chamber. "This is it." The team followed, their footsteps echoing through the cavern. They fanned out, examining the alien machinery and the strange structures. Elena's tablet pinged with new data, flooding the screen with readings she could hardly comprehend. "These energy levels. They're off the charts," Jacob said, crouching beside one of the containment units. "Whatever's in here, it's still active." "Be careful," Holt warned, his voice low. "We don't know what this place is capable of." But Elena wasn't listening. Her focus was on a single containment unit at the center of the room. It was different from the others, larger, with alien symbols glowing faintly along its surface. She approached it slowly, her hand trembling as she reached for the control panel attached to it. "Dr. Roth, wait!" one of the scientists called out, but it was too late. Elena's fingers brushed the panel, and the room erupted in light. A sharp, piercing sound filled the air, followed by a deep rumble that shook the entire facility. The containment unit began to open, its walls sliding apart like the door they had just entered. From within, a cold, black mist poured out, swirling and expanding, consuming the light around it. "Get back!" Holt shouted, grabbing Elena's arm and pulling her away. The mist filled the chamber, seeping into every corner, and the temperature plummeted. Elena gasped, her breath turning to frost in the air. Around them, the alien machinery began to hum, coming to life as the mist spread, its tendrils reaching out like living shadows. Then, the world shifted. Elena stumbled, her vision warping as time itself seemed to bend. The walls of the chamber twisted and stretched, gravity flickering between heavy and light. The other team members cried out, some collapsing as the ground beneath them gave way. "What the hell is happening?" Holt yelled, struggling to stay on his feet. Yet Elena stammered, trying to focus through the disorienting chaos. "I don't know." The mist swirled faster, its dark tendrils reaching out to envelop the team. One by one, the lights on their suits flickered out, plunging them into darkness. Elena felt her heart racing, the cold biting at her skin as she stumbled toward the exit, but the door was gone. Time stretched and compressed in unnatural ways, seconds feeling like hours, then snapping back to moments. The ground beneath them shifted violently, and Elena barely managed to stay on her feet. All around her, the environment morphed. Plants that hadn't existed before began sprouting from the ground. Their growth accelerated beyond belief. Small creatures skittered across the floor, mutating as they moved, their forms grotesque and twisted. Elena's mind raced. It's the entity. It's changing the natural laws of the planet. Time, gravity, life forms. They're all destabilizing. We need to get out of here, Holt shouted, pulling one of the scientists to his feet. Now, but as they scrambled to regroup, one of the engineers, Jacob, was caught in a sudden gravitational surge. His body lifted off the ground, weightless for a moment, before being crushed back down with a sickening crunch. Elena turned, her scream dying in her throat as she watched his broken body collapse to the floor. Panic set in. The team scattered, each member trying to find an escape, but there was none. The walls seemed to close in, the alien technology twisting into unrecognizable shapes. Time loops trapped them in endless cycles of horror, with some aging rapidly before their eyes, while others were frozen in place, their expressions locked in terror. "This is wrong," Elena gasped, clutching at the tablet in her hand, which was now flickering with unreadable data. "This isn't how it was supposed to be." Holt grabbed her arm, shaking her. "We have to move." Now, the two of them managed to pull away from the epicenter of the chaos, dodging collapsing machinery and the mutated creatures that now roamed the halls. As they ran, the environment continued to shift around Ama. What had once been a stable, lifeless planet was now a nightmare of constant transformation. Elena's mind reeled. The entity they had released wasn't just a creature, it was a force, an anomaly that had been imprisoned here for a reason. It wasn't meant to exist in this universe, and now that it was free, it was rewriting the laws of reality itself. "We need to contain it," Elena muttered, her voice shaky. "We need to put it back in the prison." "How the hell do we do that?" Holt demanded, keeping pace beside her. "I don't know," she admitted, "but if we don't, this entire planet and USA will be destroyed." Their path led them deeper into the alien ruins, the air growing colder with every step. Time continued to warp, the seconds dragging out like molasses before snapping back in violent jolts. Holt checked his communicator, but the signal was dead. There was no way to call for help. As they reached a massive chamber, Elena skidded to a halt, her eyes widening. This room was different, larger, more intricate than any they had seen before. At its center stood a massive machine, ancient yet still functional, its surface covered in the same alien symbols that adorned the prison. "This must be it," she breathed. "The control center." Holt didn't hesitate. "What do we need to do?" Elena rushed to the machine, her fingers flying over the alien controls. She didn't fully understand the technology, but her research had given her enough to work with. The symbols on the machine glowed faintly, and the ground beneath them rumbled once more. I think I can reverse the release," she said, her voice trembling. "If I can just lock it back in." The mist swirled around them, thickening as the entity sensed their intentions. Holt stood guard, his weapon drawn, but there was nothing he could shoot at. The entity was all around them, an ever-present force manipulating reality. Elena's hands shook as she worked, the machine's controls responding slowly to her commands. The air grew colder still, the pressure building as the entity fought against their efforts. "We don't have much time," Holt shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the shifting environment. "I'm trying," Elena snapped, her heart pounding in her chest. Finally, the machine hummed to life, its ancient mechanisms grinding into motion. The mist coiled slightly, its tendrils pulling back as the containment field began to re-establish itself. Elena felt a surge of hope. Maybe they could fix this, maybe they could contain the entity once more. But just as the field began to close, the mist surged forward, overwhelming the room. Elena cried out as the controls were ripped from her grasp, the machine sputtering and faltering. "No!" she screamed, her eyes wide with horror. The entity wasn't going to allow itself to be imprisoned again. It lashed out with all its power, twisting the room around them. The walls buckled, gravity reversed, and time fractured once more. Elena and Holt were thrown into the air, tumbling through the chaos. "I won't let it win," Elena whispered to herself, her vision blurring as the entity closed in. Elena clawed her way toward the machine once more, her fingers digging into the alien controls. Elena clawed her way toward the machine once more, her fingers digging into the alien controls as the world around her twisted and warped. Holt was still somewhere in the chaos, his grunts audible as he fought to keep his balance, but she couldn't focus on him. Everything depended on containing the entity, locking it back in the prison where it belonged. The alien symbols flickered erratically as she input the final sequence, each movement of her hand sluggish, as if time itself was resisting her actions. The air was thick with pressure, making it hard to breathe, but she pushed through the pain, through the disorientation, clinging to the faint hope that they could survive this. Just as her fingers brushed the final control, the mist surged again, wrapping around her like a living thing. It squeezed her chest, suffocating her, filling her lungs with ice-cold air. Her vision dimmed, the weight of the entity's presence crushing her thoughts. For a moment, she felt herself slipping away, her body going limp as the mist dragged her down. But something snapped inside her, a flicker of resolve, of anger. She wouldn't let it end like this. Not after everything they'd been through. With a final, desperate burst of strength, she slammed her hand onto the control panel. A deafening roar filled the chamber. The machine hummed to life, its ancient mechanisms grinding and shifting. The symbols glowed brighter, casting the room in an eerie light. The mist recoiled, its tendrils flailing wildly as the containment field began to close around it. Elena collapsed to the ground, gasping for air as the pressure lifted. The mist shrieked, a sound that pierced her ears and rattled her bones, but the field held firm, slowly pulling the entity back into its prison. The room shook violently, debris raining down from the ceiling as the alien technology strained under the force of the entity's resistance. Holt staggered over to her, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Did you do it?" "I think so," Elena croaked, pushing herself up on trembling arms. "But it's not over yet. We need to get out of here." The ground beneath them trembled, cracks spidering across the floor as the containment field strained to hold the entity in place. They had minutes at best before the entire structure collapsed. Elena forced herself to stand, her legs weak and unsteady, and together with Holt, they stumbled toward the exit. Behind them, the entity howled in rage, its form distorting as it was pulled deeper into the prison. The air grew heavier with every step they took, gravity shifting unpredictably, pulling them in different directions. Elena's body ached with the effort of moving through the distorted space, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. As they reached the corridor leading back to the surface, the ground gave a violent lurch, and Elena was thrown against the wall, her head snapping back against the cold stone. For a moment, her vision went black, and she felt herself slipping away, but then Holt's hand was on her shoulder, pulling her upright. "Stay with me," he growled, his grip tightening. "We're almost out." Elena nodded weakly, pushing through the haze in her mind. Together, they stumbled through the collapsing ruin, dodging falling debris and skittering across the unstable ground. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to see, but Holt's steady presence beside her kept her moving. They reached the surface just as the ground gave one final, violent heave. The ruins behind them collapsed in on themselves, a deafening roar echoing through the valley as the ancient structure crumbled to dust. For a moment, the air was still, the planet silent, as if holding its breath. Then the sky darkened. Elena looked up, her heart sinking. Above them, the once clear sky was now filled with swirling clouds of black mist, the remnants of the entity still lingering in the atmosphere. The planet itself had changed, its trees twisted and deformed, their branches stretching unnaturally toward the sky. The ground beneath their feet shifted, the very laws of nature still in flux. "We didn't stop it," Elena whispered, her voice hollow. Holt stood beside her, his face grim. "Number. But we slowed it down." Elena's chest tightened. Slowing it down wasn't enough. The entity was still here, still reshaping the planet, still unraveling the very fabric of reality. They had bought themselves some time, but it wouldn't be long before the entity found a way to break free again. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Holt's eyes hardened. "We get off this planet. We warn the others." He tapped his communicator, but there was no response. The signal was still dead. The entity's influence had cut them off from the rest of the team, from the ship orbiting above. They were stranded here, alone on a dying world. Elena's heart pounded in her chest as the realization set in. "We're trapped." Holt's jaw clenched. "Not if we can make it to the communications tower." Elena blinked, the haze of fear clearing slightly. The communications tower, it was their only hope. If they could reach it, they might be able to send a distress signal, call for help. But the tower was miles away, and the planet's surface was rapidly becoming more treacherous with every passing minute. "We don't have much time," Holt said, his voice steady. "Let's move." They set off, their pace slow but determined. The ground beneath them shifted constantly, gravity pulling them in unpredictable directions, but they kept moving, driven by the faint hope that they could still escape this nightmare. All around them, the planet continued to warp, the landscape twisting into grotesque, alien forms. Hours passed, though it was impossible to tell with the erratic flow of time. Elena's body ached, her muscles screaming in protest with every step, but she pushed through the pain. She had to. They were humanity's only hope. If they didn't make it off this planet, no one would know what had happened here. No one would know the danger that was now loose in the galaxy. As they crested a ridge, the communications tower finally came into view, its spire reaching toward the darkened sky. Elena's heart leapt in her chest, a flicker of hope sparking to life. They were close, so close. But the ground trembled beneath them once more, and this time, it wasn't just a tremor. The entity had followed them. The mist swirled at the edges of their vision, creeping closer, its tendrils reaching out to reclaim what it had lost. Holt cursed under his breath. "It's not going to let us leave." Elena's mind raced. They couldn't outrun it. Not now. The entity had grown stronger, more desperate. It was bending reality itself to stop them. They had to fight it, but how? How did you fight something that wasn't bound by the same rules as you? Then it hit her. "The machine," she muttered, her voice barely a whisper. Holt frowned. "What?" "The machine we used to contain it," Elena said, her thoughts racing. "It's ancient technology. It's meant to work with the laws of this universe. But what if? What if we use the communications tower to send a signal strong enough to disrupt the entity's influence?" Holt stared at her, his eyes narrowing. "You want to use the tower to broadcast a containment field?" "It's risky," Elena admitted. "But if we can boost the signal, it might be enough to hold the entity back long enough for us to escape." Holt hesitated, then nodded. "Let's do it." They ran toward the tower, the mist closing in around them. Elena's heart pounded in her chest as they reached the base of the structure. The control panel was covered in dust and grime, but it still worked. She quickly began inputting commands, her fingers flying over the keys. The ground shook violently, the mist swirling faster now, its tendrils reaching out to engulf them. Elena's hands trembled, but she kept working, her focus laser sharp. "Hurry," Holt growled, his voice tense. "I'm almost there," Elena muttered, her heart racing. The mist surged forward, and Holt raised his weapon, firing into the darkness, but the bullets did nothing. The entity wasn't physical. It couldn't be harmed by conventional means. Elena's fingers flew over the control panel, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The ground trembled beneath them, the tower swaying dangerously, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Finally, with a final, desperate push, she hit the last key. The tower hummed to life, its spire glowing with a bright, pulsing light. The mist recoiled, its tendrils flailing wildly as the containment field spread out from the tower, enveloping the entity. Elena collapsed to the ground, gasping for air as the pressure lifted. The mist shrieked, a sound that pierced her ears and rattled her bones, but the field held firm, slowly pulling the entity back. "We did it," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. Holt stood beside her, his face pale but resolute. "Let's get out of here." They signaled the ship, and moments later, the roar of engines filled the air as their rescue vessel descended from the sky. As they lifted off, Elena watched the planet shrink below them, its surface still warping and twisting. The entity was contained for now, but she knew the danger wasn't over. They had survived, but the galaxy had only seen a glimpse of the terror that had been unleashed. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The stars were a distant memory as the expedition ship cut through the inky blackness of space. Earth was far behind, a shell of what it once had been, consumed by its endless hunger for resources. But the future of humanity lay ahead, gleaming in the form of Pandora, a planet that pulsed with life untouched, beautiful, and abundant in the resources Earth so desperately needed. The fleet had been sent to take what was necessary. There was no room for compromise. For many, it was a second chance at survival. For others, it was conquest masked in necessity. But for Hema, the chosen experiment, the hybrid, the Avatara, it was something else entirely. James Hudson felt a strange mix of anxiety and excitement as he looked out the ship's viewport, the vibrant planet growing larger in the distance. His human eyes, blue and sharp, blinked reflexively as he leaned forward. But beneath his skin, in his very blood, something far more complex stirred. He wasn't fully human anymore, not since they altered him. He was part Navi now, linked by DNA to the indigenous people of Pandora, meant to blend in with them, to gather information that would make the conquest easier. He turned from the viewport, his hand absently brushing the back of his neck where the neural port lay embedded, a reminder of his dual nature. It had been years since the first expedition to Pandora ended in disaster, with Earth forces retreating in disgrace. But this time, humanity was returning in force, stronger, smarter, and with something they hadn't had before, him. The ship's intercom buzzed, and a familiar, cold voice filled the cabin. "Hudson, report to command." James swallowed, the knot in his throat tightening. Colonel Trent, the man responsible for this expedition's success or failure, was a ruthless leader. Trent saw the Navi as little more than an obstacle to be cleared, a primitive race standing in the way of Earth's salvation. The colonel didn't understand the Navi. James wasn't sure he fully did either, but he had begun to feel something a pull toward them. As he entered the command center, the usual crowd of officers and scientists bustled around, preparing for landing. Screens flickered with information, charts of Pandora's landscape, and weather patterns. Colonel Trent stood in the center, his broad shoulders squared and his face set in its usual grim expression. His cold eyes found James the moment he entered. "You're ready, Hudson?" the colonel asked, though it sounded more like an order than a question. James nodded, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "Yes, sir." Trent stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Good, because when we land, there's no turning back. Your mission is critical. We need those Navi tribes neutralized or, at the very least, on our side. If you fail, it's not just you that'll pay the price. All of Earth is counting on you." James nodded again, feeling the weight of the mission press down on him like a physical force. He'd trained for this moment for years. They had prepared him for it, altered his body, and shaped his mind. But no amount of preparation could fully prepare him for what lay ahead. "Remember, Hudson," Trent continued, his voice low and dangerous, "you may look like them, but you're one of us. Never forget that." James felt his heart thud in his chest as Trent's words echoed in his mind. He was human. He was an experiment. But what was he, really? As the ship broke through Pandora's atmosphere, the vibrant world came into view, a kaleidoscope of lush forests, towering mountains, and swirling rivers. Everything about this planet was alive, pulsating with a life force that James could feel even from the confines of the ship. The landing was smooth, too smooth, James thought, considering what they were about to do. As soon as the ship touched down, the military forces began deploying, securing the area with their heavy artillery, their towering mechs, and their grim determination. James felt the first stirrings of doubt as he prepared for his mission. He was to infiltrate a Na'vi tribe, earn their trust, and relay critical information back to Trent. It seemed simple enough on paper, but standing on Pandora's soil, breathing in its air, feeling the ground pulse beneath him, he realized how naive that plan was. For the first time, he wondered if he was ready for this. The Na'vi had not forgotten the first human invasion. They would not welcome him easily. And yet, his mission required it. He was their bridge, the one who would make the impossible happen. But standing there, surrounded by human soldiers preparing for war, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far bigger than himself. It didn't take long for him to find the Na'vi, or rather, for them to find him. He had been walking for hours, deep into the forest, marveling at how Pandora seemed to hum with life. Trees towered above him, their bioluminescent leaves glowing faintly in the dim light. Strange creatures scuttled through the underbrush, while others soared through the air, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the darkening sky. Suddenly, he felt Ida's presence, silent but unmistakable. His heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had been trained for this moment. He knew the Na'vi would approach him when they were ready, and not a moment before. It was near dusk when they appeared, slipping out from the shadows like living phantoms. Tall, lean, and graceful, the Na'vi moved with a fluidity that made James feel awkward and slow in comparison. Their golden eyes glowed in the fading light as they circled him, their expressions cautious and curious. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, stepped forward. She spoke in their language, her voice low and melodic, but James didn't need the translation implant to understand her meaning. "Who are you?" James took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was it, his moment of truth. "I am one of you," he said in halting Na'vi, the language still strange on his tongue, but also not. The woman's eyes narrowed, but she did not move. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze sweeping over his hybrid form, taking in the strange combination of human and Na'vi features. James held her gaze, refusing to look away, though every instinct screamed at him to run. Finally, she spoke again, this time in a tone that sent a chill down his spine. "Then what are you?" James hesitated. He could feel the weight of her question pressing down on him, demanding an answer that he wasn't sure he had. Was he human? Was he Na'vi? Or was he something else entirely, caught between two worlds, belonging to neither? "I am here to learn," he said slowly. "To understand." The woman's eyes flickered with something James couldn't quite place. She studied him for another long moment before nodding slightly. "Then come. But know this, outsider, if you betray us, there will be no mercy." The Na'vi were not what James had expected. They were more than the fierce warriors the military had described. They were a people deeply connected to their world, to each other, and to the life force they called Iwa. Over the days that followed, James found himself drawn deeper into their way of life. He hunted with them, learned their songs, and sat with them in the evenings, listening to their stories of the past. At first, they kept their distance, watching him with weary eyes, but gradually, they began to accept him, or at least tolerate his presence. The woman who had first confronted him, whose name he learned was Nra, seemed particularly intrigued by him. She was a leader among her people, strong and fierce, but also wise in a way that James had never encountered before. As the days turned into weeks, James found himself questioning everything he had been told about Pandora and the Na'vi. They were not savages, as the military had claimed. They were a proud and noble people, deeply connected to the world around them. The more time he spent with them, the more he began to understand the depth of their connection to Pandora and to Iwa. But the military's presence loomed over him like a dark cloud. Trent's voice echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the mission he had been sent to accomplish. Each day, he sent back reports, careful not to reveal too much, but knowing that eventually, the time would come when he would have to choose between his orders and his growing loyalty to the Na'vi. The turning point came when Nur led him to the Tree of Souls, the sacred place where the Na'vi connected with Iwa. James had heard of it before, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. The tree towered above them, its glowing tendrils swaying gently in the breeze, pulsing with a life force that James could feel deep in his bones. "This is our heart," Nur said softly as they stood beneath the tree. "Through Iwa, we were all connected. The past, the present, the future, it is all one." James reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched one of the glowing tendrils. Instantly, he felt a surge of energy rush through him, a connection that went beyond anything he had ever experienced. For a brief moment, he saw the world through the eyes of the Na'vi, felt their pain, their joy, their fear, and their love for this world that was so different from Earth. It was in that moment that James realized the truth. He couldn't go through with it. He couldn't betray these people, he couldn't betray Pandora. But what could he do? The military was preparing for an all-out assault, and they would stop at nothing to take what they wanted. James knew that if he didn't act, Pandora would be lost forever. James stood in silence beneath the towering Tree of Souls, his heart pounding in his chest as the connection to Iwa faded. The lingering sense of unity, of belonging, left him with an ache he hadn't expected. This was beyond anything he could have anticipated. Pandora wasn't just a planet, a place to be mined for resources and left barren. It was alive, intensely, vibrantly alive in a way that Earth hadn't been in centuries. Nur's gaze stayed on him, her expression hard to read, but her eyes were filled with a quiet intensity. "Do you understand now?" she asked softly. He nodded, but his mind was racing. Understanding wasn't the problem, it was knowing what to do with that understanding. His orders from Colonel Trent were explicit: to gain the trust of the Na'vi, gather intelligence, and, when the time came, assist in dismantling their defenses. But standing here, feeling Pandora's pulse beneath his feet, he realized the cost of those orders. If he followed through, if he did as he was told, it wouldn't just be the Na'vi who suffered, the entire planet would be destroyed. But defying Trent meant certain death. The military didn't forgive traitors. He'd be hunted down, made an example of. Worse, they would still come for Pandora. They wouldn't stop just because one man chose to switch sides. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the forest, Nur turned and gestured for him to follow. They made their way back to the Na'vi settlement in silence, but the weight of James's decision pressed on him with every step. He couldn't betray these people, not after all he had seen, not after the connection he had felt with Iwa. But what could one man do against an entire military force? The night was unusually quiet, the usual hum of Pandora's creatures replaced by an eerie stillness. James lay awake in his hammock, staring up at the sky through the canopy of leaves, his mind racing with possibilities. He had to act, but he didn't know where to begin. His reports back to the military had been deliberately vague in recent days, but soon, Trent would want more. He'd demand results. And when those results didn't come, they would send someone else, someone less conflicted, someone who wouldn't hesitate to wipe out the Na'vi. In the dead of night, he made his decision. He would warn them. He would tell Nra and the others what was coming and help them prepare. He didn't know how they could fight against the advanced weaponry of the human military, but they had the advantage of knowing the terrain. They had their bond with Pandora, and James had to believe that would count for something. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the settlement, James found Nra standing at the edge of the village, her eyes scanning the horizon. She didn't turn when he approached, but he could tell she knew he was there. "We don't have much time," he said quietly, his voice tight with urgency. She finally looked at him, her expression calm but questioning. "The humans," he continued, "they're coming. They're preparing an assault, and it's going to be massive. They're not just after resources anymore. They're coming to take everything." Noor's eyes darkened, but she didn't seem surprised. "We knew this day would come." "There's more," James said, his throat tightening. They plan to destroy the Tree of Souls." That got her attention. Noor's face hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "They would not dare." "They would," he replied grimly. "And they will, unless we stop them." Noor turned fully to face him now, her gaze piercing. "You're one of them." "Why should we trust you?" James had expected the question, but it still stung. He had spent weeks with these people, lived among them, and yet he was still an outsider. But he understood. He had lied to them from the beginning, played the role of the loyal human infiltrator. Now, when everything was on the line, trust was not something that could be easily earned. "I'm not one of them," he said, the words coming out firmer than he had expected. "Not anymore. I've seen what this place is, what Iwa means to you, and I can't let them destroy it." "I won't." Nri studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We will prepare." In the hours that followed, the Navy mobilized. James worked alongside them, helping where he could, though he knew it would never be enough. The Navy fought with bows and spears, with the natural power of their world at their backs, but they were up against an army armed with gunships, artillery, and exosuits. He tried to teach them what he could about human tactics, about the weaknesses of the machines they would face. But it still felt hopeless. As night fell once again, the tension in the air was palpable. The Navy gathered around the Tree of Souls, offering prayers to Iwa, asking for guidance and protection. James stood among them, feeling out of place and yet deeply connected to this moment. He wasn't Navy, but he wasn't human anymore either, not in the way that mattered. When the attack came, it was swift and brutal. The sky lit up with the glow of gunships and rockets, the roar of engines filling the air. The ground shook as the first wave of human forces descended upon the Navy settlement. The Navy fought back fiercely, using the terrain to their advantage, striking from the trees and blending into the shadows. But the human forces were relentless, their advanced weaponry cutting through the forest like a blade. James found himself in the thick of the battle, his avatar body moving with a speed and agility that felt foreign and yet instinctive. He fought alongside the Navy, his bow in hand, striking down soldiers with a precision that surprised even him. But the human forces kept coming, wave after wave, their gunships circling above, raining fire down on the Navy below. Through the chaos, James caught sight of Colonel Trent, standing at the edge of the battlefield, watching with cold, calculating eyes. He was directing the assault, his every movement precise, detached. James knew that Trent didn't care about the lives lost, not the human soldiers, and certainly not the Navy. To him, this was a means to an end. Rage boiled up inside James, a deep, primal anger that he hadn't felt before. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for Pandora, for everything this planet represented. And Trent, with his cold indifference, was the embodiment of everything James had come to despise. He didn't think, he just moved. James darted through the battlefield, dodging gunfire and explosions, his eyes locked on Trent. He didn't know what he would do when he reached him, but he knew he had to stop him, had to end this. As he closed the distance, Trent finally noticed him. A flicker of surprise crossed the colonel's face, quickly replaced by contempt. "Hudson," he spat. "I should have known you'd betray us." James didn't respond. He couldn't. The anger pulsing through him made words impossible. He lunged at Trent, his bow raised, but the colonel was faster than he looked. He sidestepped James's attack and pulled a gun from his holster, aiming it squarely at James's chest. "You're just like them," Trent snarled. "Weak." "Na a tilde macron v. You actually believe you can save this place?" James gritted his teeth, his body tense. "This place doesn't need saving, it needs to be left alone." Trent's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, A sudden roar filled the air. The ground trembled, and James looked up just in time to see one of Pandora's massive beasts, Sciencefiction, swooping down from the sky. Its enormous wings beat the air as it dove toward the battlefield, scattering the human forces in its path. Trent's eyes widened in shock, and in that moment of distraction, James moved. He knocked the gun from Trent's hand and drove him to the ground, pinning him beneath his weight. For a moment, they struggled, but James had the advantage. He raised his fist, ready to strike, but then hesitated. Killing Trent wouldn't end this. Stopping one man wouldn't change the course of the battle. The humans would keep coming, no matter what. Instead, James stood, his chest heaving, and looked down at Trent, who lay in the dirt, breathing heavily, his face twisted in rage. "It's over," James said quietly. "You've lost," Trent sneered. "You think this is over? It's just the beginning." But James didn't listen. He turned and walked away, his mind already on what had to be done next. The battle raged on around him, but he knew that this wasn't the end. It was just another beginning. He had made his choice. He had chosen Pandora, and now, he would live with the consequences. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The dense canopy of Pandora spread out like an emerald ocean, shimmering under the planet's gentle light. Years had passed since the Na'vi pushed back the human invaders, their towering trees and glowing fauna once again thriving in peaceful harmony. But peace, as the Na'vi knew too well, was often fragile. Tarak stood at the edge of a wide, tranquil river, its waters gleaming in soft blue hues as they wound through the ancient forest. His reflection stared back at him, the deep-set eyes of a warrior who had only known battle and sacrifice for his people. He'd fought to protect this land, his home, and now a new threat loomed over the horizon. Unlike the war with the Sky People, this enemy was invisibly a sickness, a creeping decay spreading through the life force of Pandora itself. Bending down, he dipped his fingers into the water. It felt colder than usual. A few months ago, the river had been warm, full of energy and vitality. Now, it felt a broken bar drained. He looked up to the towering trees that lined the riverbank. The vibrant glow they once emitted had dimmed, their bark peeling, the leaves tinged with brown. With a deep breath, Tarak straightened up and walked back toward the village. His mother, Idukn, the matriarch of the Na'vi Council, had summoned him. His steps were heavy as the thought of what awaited him gnawed at his mind. The Na'vi believed their connection to Pandora was eternal, unbreakable. But now, it felt as though that bond was fraying, slipping out of their control. In the distance, the large gathering of Na'vi warriors, healers, and council members came into view. They stood around a sacred tree of souls, its soft tendrils gently swaying, illuminated by a faint glow. Yet, even that glow seemed weaker now. Tarak approached Idukn, who stood in the center of the gathering. Her face was etched with the weariness of leadership, her once piercing gaze clouded by worry. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip strong despite her age. "We are losing Pandora, my son," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the council. "The forests are dying, the rivers turning cold. Even the creatures grow restless. We do not understand why." Tarak nodded solemnly. "I have seen it, Mother. The river is not what it once was. It feels so broken bar sick." Idukn's eyes hardened, but her expression remained thoughtful. "We have sent messages to the other clans. They too have seen the signs. It spreads faster than we anticipated." One of the elders stepped forward, his voice grave. "We cannot let this continue. If the sickness reaches the Tree of Souls, our connection to Pandora will be severed forever. We must act now." Before anyone could respond, a strange buzzing sound filled the air. Tarak's gaze shot upward. In the sky, the unmistakable silhouette of a human aircraft hovered just above the treetops. The Na'vi warriors immediately bristled, gripping their weapons tightly. It had been years since the humans had been allowed this close to Na'vi territory. A voice crackled through a speaker, loud and unfamiliar. "Na'vi people, we come in peace. We bring news of the sickness. Please, Allow us to help. Tarak's fist tightened around the hilt of his knife. Humans, he hissed, his voice low with contempt. Idokn held up her hand, signaling for calm. Let them speak, she said, her voice carrying the weight of authority. The warriors stepped back, though their eyes never left the hovering ship. Moments later, the aircraft landed softly, and from its door stepped a small group of humans in sleek, unfamiliar suits. At their lead was a woman, tall, with sharp features and piercing green eyes. She stepped forward, hands raised in a gesture of peace. My name is Dr. Clara Hayden, she said, her voice steady. We've been monitoring Pandora from our orbital station. The virus that's spreading through your forests and waters, it's not natural. It's a foreign contaminant, likely introduced from outside the planet. Idokn narrowed her eyes. Why should we trust you, Sky people? You brought death and destruction to our world once before. Clara lowered her gaze, regret flickering in her eyes. What happened years ago was a tragedy, one that I had no part in. But I'm here now to help. My team of scientists has been studying this virus, and we believe we can stop Haida, but we can't do it alone. We need your help. Tarak took a step forward, his chest tight with anger. We need nothing from you. Clara met his glare head on. I understand your mistrust, but this virus will not stop at your forests. It will kill everything, including your people. Pandora is dying. A heavy silence fell over the gathering as the weight of her words sank in. Idokn turned to Tarak, her expression unreadable. What do you think, my son? Tarak's heart pounded in his chest. Every fiber of his being screamed to reject these humans, to turn them away and protect Pandora with his own hands. But deep down, he knew they were out of time. The sickness was spreading too fast. We have no choice, Tarak said finally, though the words tasted bitter. We must work with them. Idokn nodded, her face grave. Then it is decided. We will work together to save Pandora. Days passed in a blur of frantic activity. Navi warriors and Earth scientists, once bitter enemies, now found themselves side by side, trying to understand the virus ravaging Pandora's ecosystem. Tarak led hunting parties to gather samples of infected plants and animals, while Clara and her team worked tirelessly to analyze the data. Despite their efforts, the virus showed no signs of slowing. Each day, more and more of Pandora's sacred lands fell to its invisible grip. Tarak grew restless, the weight of his people's survival pressing down on him. He watched as Clara and her team worked with a determination he hadn't expected, but doubt lingered in his mind. One night, unable to sleep, Tarak ventured deep into the forest alone. He walked until the trees grew thin, the ground beneath him cracked and dry. The virus had taken this part of Pandora completely, the once vibrant life drained of color and energy. Suddenly, his vision blurred, and he felt a strange pull deep within his chest. He stumbled forward, his legs weak, and collapsed at the base of a large tree. The ground felt cold against his skin, but the sensation quickly faded as a vision overtook him. His surroundings melted away, replaced by a swirling sea of colors and lights. Tarak found himself standing before the Tree of Souls, its glowing tendrils reaching out to him. He could feel its energy coursing through him, pulling him deeper into its embrace. Why do you call me here? He whispered into the void. A voice echoed in his mind, soft and ancient. The sickness comes from the depths of Pandora, from a place long forgotten. To stop it, you must go where no Navi has ventured before. The vision shifted, and Tarak saw a vast canyon, its walls jagged and towering. Deep within the canyon lay a dark, swirling abyss, a place of ancient power, untouched by time or life. You must journey to the great abyss, the voice said. There, you will find the answers you seek. Tarak awoke with a start, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He lay still for a moment, the weight of the vision pressing down on him. The great abyss, a place of legend, feared by the Navi for generations. Few had ever ventured there, and none had returned. But now, it seemed, he had no choice. Tarak returned to the village just before dawn, His mind still swirling with the vision of the great abyss, he made his way to where the council and Clara's team were working. The weariness on their faces mirrored his own, but there was no time for rest. As he entered the large tent, Clara glanced up from her array of equipment, her expression troubled. "We've mapped the spread of the virus," she said, not bothering with greetings. "It's worse than we thought. If we can't find a solution soon, it'll wipe out the entire ecosystem. Everything, animals, plants, even the soil." Tarak nodded, his gaze distant. "I know where we need to go." Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" Tarak hesitated for a moment, the weight of the vision still heavy on his mind. But he knew what needed to be done. "I had a vision from the Tree of Souls. It showed me where the sickness comes from. There's a place, deep within Pandora, an abyss that holds the key to stopping this." Clara's brows furrowed. "An abyss? Are you saying this virus is a broken bar natural to Pandora?" "It is ancient," Tarak said, his voice low. "A force that has been buried for many generations. If we are to stop it, we must go to the Great Abyss." The room fell silent, the Navi elders exchanging uneasy glances. They knew of the Great Abyss, though few had ever spoken of it. It was a place of legend, feared for its darkness and danger. No one had ever returned from its depths. Clara broke the silence, her voice steady. "If that's where the source is, then that's where we'll go. But it won't be easy." Tarak met her gaze, surprised by her resolve. "It is not a place for your people. The Great Abyss is dangerous, and many have lost their lives there." "We don't have a choice," Clara replied firmly. "We're all in this together now. We'll prepare the expedition immediately." Within hours, they had assembled a team. Tarak would lead the way, accompanied by a group of Navi warriors and a handful of Clara's scientists. Their journey would take them far beyond the familiar territories of Pandora, into the untamed wilderness that even the Navi avoided. Tarak could feel the weight of his ancestors' warning in his chest, but he pushed it aside. Pandora's survival depended on them. As they ventured deeper into the wild, the landscape began to shift. The vibrant, glowing forests of Pandora gave way to barren stretches of land. The trees gnarled and blackened. The ground beneath their feet was cracked and dry, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. The further they traveled, the more Tarak could feel the sickness in the land, a malevolent force creeping through the very soil of Pandora. The journey was perilous. They encountered strange, mutated creatures along the way, animals that had once been part of Pandora's ecosystem but were now twisted by the virus. The Navi fought bravely, their arrows finding their marks, but the creatures grew more aggressive the closer they came to the abyss. Clara and her team collected samples, their faces etched with concern. The virus was evolving faster than they could track. It had already mutated several times since they had begun the research, making it even more difficult to predict how it would affect Pandora in the long term. After several days of travel, they reached the edge of the Great Abyss. It was a vast canyon, its walls jagged and towering, stretching deep into the earth. A dark mist rose from its depths, swirling ominously in the air. Tarak stood at the edge, staring down into the abyss. It was as he had seen in his vision, ancient, untouched by time or life. The place radiated a sense of foreboding, as if the land itself was warning them to turn back. "We're here," he said quietly. Clara stepped up beside him, her eyes scanning the canyon below. "This is it, then." "Whatever's down there, broken bar, it's what's causing all of this." Tarak nodded. "The virus comes from the depths. But it is not just a sickness, it is something more, something ancient." The group descended carefully into the abyss, the air growing colder and thicker with every step. The walls of the canyon loomed over them, their surfaces etched with strange, unrecognizable markings. The deeper they went, the more the land seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, the very air vibrating with power. They reached the bottom of the canyon after hours of careful climbing. The ground was soft and spongy beneath their feet, as if they were walking on the decayed remnants of something long forgotten. Tarak could feel the pull of the abyss, a deep, primal force tugging at his soul. In the center of the canyon, they found a massive, swirling vortex of dark energy, its surface crackling with electricity. It pulsed rhythmically, like the heartbeat of some ancient, slumbering beast. The air around it shimmered, distorting the space and light around them. "These a broken bar, this is it," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the vortex. "This is the source." Tarak nodded, stepping closer to the vortex. He could feel its power radiating outward, seeping into the land, poisoning everything it touched. This was the heart of the sickness at the ancient force that had lain dormant beneath Pandora for centuries. "We need to stop it," Clara said, her voice urgent. "But how? We don't even understand what it is." Tarak closed his eyes, reaching out with his spirit to the Tree of Souls, searching for guidance. In his mind's eye, he saw the ancient city of the Navi, long abandoned and hidden deep within the abyss. The city's technology held the key to controlling this force, but it would require immense energy to power it, energy that could destabilize Pandora even further. He opened his eyes, turning to Clara. "There is a way. The city of our ancestors lies deeper within the abyss. Its technology can stop the sickness, but it is dangerous. We may not survive." Clara's expression hardened. "We'll survive. We have to." The group moved deeper into the abyss, guided by the visions of the ancient city. They found it buried beneath layers of rock and sediment, its structures twisted and decayed from centuries of neglect. But the core of the city still pulsed with energy, its ancient systems flickering to life as Tarak and the others approached. Clara and her team worked quickly, deciphering the Navi technology and connecting it to their own equipment. The process was grueling, and time was running out. The virus had already reached the edge of the abyss, and it wouldn't be long before it consumed them all. Tarak stood guard as Clara and her team activated the ancient machinery. The ground trembled beneath them, the air crackling with energy as the system roared to life. A blinding light erupted from the heart of the city, shooting upward into the sky, its power reaching deep into the earth. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the vortex in the center of the abyss began to shrink, its dark energy slowly dissipating into the air. The ground beneath their feet stopped shaking, and the oppressive weight of the sickness lifted. The virus was gone. Tarak let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his chest tight with relief. They had done it. Pandora was safe. But the cost had been great. As they made their way out of the abyss, the land around them began to change. New life sprouted from the ground, plants and trees growing at an accelerated rate, their vibrant colors returning. But the landscape was different now. A new Pandora, reshaped by the ancient forces that had once threatened to destroy it. Tarak and Clara stood at the edge of the abyss, watching as the world around them came to life once more. They had saved Pandora, but the planet would never be the same. "It's beautiful," Clara whispered, her voice filled with awe. Tarak nodded, his gaze distant. "It is, but we must remain vigilant. Pandora will always need protecting." Clara turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've saved your world, Tarak, and you've shown me that we can work together, despite everything that's happened." Tarak met her gaze, his heart filled with a strange sense of hope. "Perhaps there is a future for both our peoples." They stood together in silence, watching as Pandora began its new era of growth and regeneration. The great abyss still loomed behind them, a reminder of the ancient forces that had once threatened their world. But now, with the virus gone and the land healed, Pandora had a chance to thrive once more. And Tarak knew that, whatever the future held, he would be there to protect it. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The surface of Pandora stretched out in all its untamed beauty, a vibrant expanse of alien wilderness, untouched by human hands until now. Dr. Ethan Vale stood at the edge of the observation deck, peering out at the planet below. He marveled at the swirling greens and blues of the forests and rivers, the vast plains that stretched endlessly into the horizon. There was something serene, almost sacred, about Pandora. Its balance felt tangible, as though every breath the planet exhaled fed directly into the cycle of life. The glass beneath his palm felt cool, a stark contrast to the heat that rushed through his veins as anticipation built within him. After years of work, of simulations and prototypes, they had finally done it. The Neural Convergence Interface ANCI, as they called ITA, was ready. And he, Dr. Ethan Vale, was the man who would pioneer the connection between human consciousness and Pandora's soul. Dr. Vale, came a voice from behind. "They're ready for you in the lab." Ethan turned to see his colleague, Dr. Maria Reese, standing in the doorway. Her expression was a mix of awe and apprehension, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She understood, as well as he did, the magnitude of what they were about to do. They were about to cross a threshold no human had ever crossed before. But while Maria's face betrayed her anxiety, Ethan's heart only pounded with exhilaration. "I'll be right there," he said, flashing her a reassuring smile. As she disappeared down the corridor, Ethan took one last look at the planet. Soon, he wouldn't just be looking at Pandora from above, he would be part of it, immersed in its very essence. The lab was buzzing with activity when he arrived. Monitors hummed, scientists murmured as they made last-minute adjustments, and the NCI machine itself stood at the center of the room, towering over everything. Its sleek, metallic exterior gleamed under the fluorescent lights, while its quarry and intricate web of neural connectors pulsed faintly with energy. This was the gateway to the sea of consciousness. "Are you sure about this?" Maria asked as Ethan approached the machine. Her voice was low, her eyes scanning his face for any hint of doubt. Ethan smiled again, though this time it was softer, almost tender. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Maria's gaze lingered for a moment longer before she nodded, stepping back to give him space. Ethan climbed into the machine, feeling the cool metal wrap around his limbs as the neural connectors locked into place around his head. The hum of the machinery grew louder, vibrating through his body. Beginning synchronization, came a voice over the intercom. Ethan took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and let the sensation wash over him. There was a brief moment of disorientation as the NCI took hold, pulling his consciousness into the system. And then, everything shifted. At first, there was nothing. Just an endless expanse of darkness, an emptiness that stretched on forever. But slowly, shapes began to form, a faint at first, like the outlines of dreams, but soon they solidified into something more tangible. He felt it before he saw it, the pulse of life, the rhythm of Pandora. It was as if the entire planet was breathing, and Ethan was caught in its exhale. The sea of consciousness unfolded before him, vast and incomprehensible. It wasn't water, not exactly, but it flowed like a river, shimmering with energy that radiated from every living thing on the planet. Trees, animals, even the very soil seemed to pulse with the same rhythm, all interconnected by this invisible force. Ethan felt himself drawn into it, his consciousness melding with the flow. He saw the forests, the rivers, the mountains, all from a perspective that was both his and not his at the same time. He could feel the lifeblood of the planet coursing through everything. The sensation was overwhelming, but in the most extraordinary way. There were no boundaries here, no limits. He wasn't just observing Pandora's ecosystem, he was part of it. Time lost all meaning as he drifted through the sea. He felt the warmth of the sun on his skin, even though he knew it wasn't real. He heard the wind rustling through the leaves of trees he'd never seen before, but he knew them now, in a way no one else ever could. He could feel the consciousness of the creatures around him, a collective hum of life that vibrated through his very core. And then, deeper still, he felt something else, a presence. It was subtle at first, like a whisper just beyond the edge of his awareness. But as he focused on it, the presence grew stronger, more defined. It wasn't a voice, not in the traditional sense, but it communicated nonetheless a vast, ancient intelligence, one that had existed long before humans ever set foot on Pandora. The soul of the planet. Ethan's heart raced. This was what they had been searching for, the consciousness of Pandora itself, the key to unlocking the mysteries of the planet's perfect balance. He could feel it now, a living, breathing entity that governed the flow of life across the entire planet. It wasn't sentient in the way humans understood sentience, but it was alive, and it was aware. He reached out with his mind, trying to make contact, to bridge the gap between human and planet. For a brief moment, he felt a connection and understanding, a merging of thoughts. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. Ethan blinked, disoriented. The sea of consciousness swirled around him, but something felt off now. The rhythm, once so steady and harmonious, seemed disrupted. Subtle at first, like a faint ripple in still water, but the ripple grew larger, spreading out in all directions. He tried to focus, to center himself, but the disruption only intensified. The flow of energy around him began to warp, twisting and turning in ways that felt unnatural. He could feel the balance of the planet shifting, destabilizing. What's happening? He thought, panic rising in his chest. The answer came not from words, but from the very essence of the planet itself. The NCI, the connection between human consciousness and Pandora's soul system. It wasn't just tapping into the planet's energy, it was altering it. The presence he had felt before, the soul of Pandora, was reacting to the intrusion of his consciousness, and not in a good way. The ripple became a wave, a violent surge of energy that pushed back against him, trying to expel his presence from the sea. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He had to sever the connection, had to pull himself out before it was too late. But the more he tried to disengage, the stronger the wave became, pulling him deeper into the chaos. He fought against it, struggling to regain control. The lab, the NCI, everything outside the sea of consciousness felt so distant now, like a dream he couldn't quite remember. All that mattered was the planet's pulse, and it was out of control. He felt himself being pushed to the edge of the sea, his consciousness on the verge of being expelled. But just as he thought he would be torn away completely, something shifted. The wave of energy slowed, softened, and then, for a brief moment, everything was still. Ethan hung there, suspended in the void, waiting. He didn't know what had just happened, but he could feel the presence of Pandora's soul once again, watching, waiting. It hadn't rejected him entirely, at least, not yet. But he knew then, with a clarity that cut through the haze, that the NCI was dangerous. The technology, as revolutionary as it was disrupting the very fabric of Pandora's ecosystem. If they continued, if they pushed further, they could destroy the planet's balance completely. And it would be his fault. Ethan's heart raced as the realization hit him. They were playing with fire. Pandora was far more complex than they had imagined. The sea of consciousness was not just a passive network waiting to be tapped. It was alive, reactive, and deeply intertwined with every living being on the planet. What they had seen as a technological triumph was, in fact, a ticking time bomb. The more they intruded, the more they risked collapsing the natural balance that had sustained Pandora for eons. But as much as he knew what needed to be done, disengaging wasn't an option anymore. Not right now. His mind remained intertwined with Pandora's consciousness, tethered by the NCI. Any attempt to disconnect could cause catastrophic feedback. It was like trying to pull a thread from a tightly woven fabric. One wrong move, and the entire system could unravel. He forced himself to breathe deeply, studying his thoughts. He needed to think clearly, to assess the situation from within the sea of consciousness and find a way to fix this. The presence of Pandora's soul lingered, watching him. It was more than an awareness, it was as if the planet was trying to communicate with him, trying to warn him. He focused on that feeling, reaching out again with his mind. This time, instead of probing for answers, he opened himself up to Pandora, allowing its energy to flow through him freely. The sensation was overwhelming, like standing in the middle of a raging storm. Yet, at the core of it, there was a profound calm, a delicate equilibrium. He began to understand. Pandora's soul wasn't just an energy field, it was a symbiotic entity, An intricate balance of life and consciousness that operated on its own terms. It wasn't meant to be controlled or manipulated by outside forces. The more they tried, the more it would resist. And then he saw the damage they had already caused. The sea of consciousness revealed itself in layers, an intricate web connecting every species, every ecosystem, every river and tree on the planet. But there were fractures now, small but growing. The NCI had introduced instability, disrupting the flow of energy between Pandora's core systems. If they didn't stop, those fractures would widen, spreading like a disease across the planet, until the balance collapsed entirely. He had to act. But how? Ethan's mind raced. There was no time to go back to the lab, no time to debate with the others. He had to find a way to stabilize the connection from within. If he could reinforce the natural energy pathways and withdraw the NCI's influence, perhaps Pandora could heal itself. He focused on the presence of Pandora's soul once more, feeling the pulse of its energy. He let his consciousness sink deeper into the flow, aligning himself with the rhythm of the planet. It was like tuning a finely calibrated instrument, a delicate, precise. Slowly, carefully, he began to pull back the artificial tendrils of the NCI, unraveling the human-made threads that had embedded themselves into Pandora's system. The planet pushed back at first, resisting the interference. But Ethan persisted, moving cautiously, guiding the flow of energy back into its natural pathways. The fractures in the sea began to close, the ripples smoothing out. It was working. But just as he felt the balance beginning to restore itself, a sudden jolt of pain shot through his mind. The NCI flared, sending a shockwave of feedback through his neural link. He gasped, the connection faltering. He could feel the system fighting against him, the technology trying to assert itself once more. His body tensed in the machine, muscles seizing as the strain of maintaining the connection weighed on him. He couldn't keep this up much longer. He was caught in a tug of war between Pandora and the NCI. His consciousness stretched to the breaking point. But he couldn't give up. Not now. With every ounce of strength he had left, Ethan focused his mind, pushing against the NCI's influence. He had to sever the connection, fully this time, before it was too late. His thoughts blurred, pain radiating through his skull, but he refused to let go. If he stopped now, Pandora's balance would collapse, and it would be his fault. Finally, with one last push, he felt the neural link snap. The connection severed. Ethan's consciousness recoiled, pulled back into his own mind with such force that it left him gasping for air. His body slumped in the NCI machine, muscles trembling as he struggled to regain his bearings. He was back in the lab. The lights were dim, and the hum of the machinery around him sounded distant, muffled. His vision swam, the edges of his awareness still hazy from the ordeal. But he was here. He had made it back. Ethan! Maria's voice pierced through the fog, her face coming into focus as she rushed to his side. Ethan, can you hear me? He nodded weakly, trying to sit up. His limbs felt heavy, as though they were made of lead. But he managed to pull himself upright, the weight of his body slowly easing as the effects of the NCI faded. What happened? He rasped, his throat dry. Maria glanced nervously at the monitors, her face pale. We lost you for a minute. The system went haywire. There was a massive energy spike. We had to cut the feed manually. Ethan's heart sank. The NCI. It's unstable, Maria said, shaking her head. Whatever happened in there, the system couldn't handle it. Ethan closed his eyes, the memory of the sea of consciousness still fresh in his mind. He had saved Pandora for now, but the damage had already been done. The NCI was too dangerous, too invasive. If they continued using it, Pandora's balance would collapse, and the planet's ecosystem would be destroyed. We can't go back in, he said quietly. Not ever. Maria's eyes widened. Ethan, what are you talking about? We've barely scratched the surface. Do you realize what this technology could mean for humanity, for science? I do, he replied, his voice strained. But it's too dangerous. The NCI is disrupting Pandora's natural balance. If we keep using it, we'll destroy the planet. Maria stared at him, disbelief flickering across her face. You're serious? Ethan nodded. Pandora isn't just a resource, it's a living system, and we're tearing it apart. Silence hung between them as Maria processed his words. She glanced at the NCI, then back at him, her expression conflicted. What do we do? Ethan leaned back in the chair, exhaustion pulling at his every fiber. We shut it down. For good. Maria hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. She reached for the console, her fingers hovering over the controls. Are you sure? He met her gaze, his resolve firm. I'm sure. With a deep breath, Maria pressed the button, and the NCI powered down. The hum of the machine faded into silence, the lights dimming as the system shut off. Ethan felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. It was over. But as the lab fell quiet, a new weight settled on his shoulders. The NCI had been his life's work, years of research, development, and hope, all aimed at unlocking the mysteries of Pandora. And now, it was gone. He had sacrificed everything to protect the planet, but at what cost? He closed his eyes, letting the silence envelop him. His mind wandered back to the sea of consciousness, to the presence he had felt through the soul of Pandora. Vast and unknowable. He had glimpsed something extraordinary, something beyond human comprehension. But in the end, he had chosen to let it go. Because some things were more important than progress. As the weight of exhaustion finally pulled him under, Ethan knew he had made the right choice. Pandora's balance had been restored, and the planet would continue to thrive. It would remain untouched by human hands, its mysteries preserved for future generations to wonder about, but never to disturb. And perhaps, in the end, that was how it should be. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. Ethan Cross was no stranger to the feeling of abandonment. He had lived through war zones, betrayals, and the cold calculations of military hierarchy for most of his life. But nothing compared to being left for dead on Pandora, one of the most unforgiving planets in the universe. The jungle around him pulsed with life, a far cry from the cold steel of the military base he once called home. His leg was torn open, a deep wound that had festered for days now, and every step felt like 1,000 needles stabbing into his skin. The voices of his former comrades echoed in his mind, the orders, the dismissal, and finally, the silence as they flew away without him. Expendable, they had called him, a useful pawn in a game much larger than he ever realized. And now, bleeding out, barely able to stand, he knew they had won. The jungle would swallow him whole, his body disappearing among the vines, nothing left to mark his grave. He stumbled, his vision blurring as the heat and humidity overwhelmed him. His foot caught on something, and he fell hard onto the ground. He tried to push himself up, but his body wouldn't respond. Instead, he lay there, eyes closed, waiting for the end. But Pandora wasn't done with him yet. Ethan wasn't sure how long he lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness, but at some point, he felt hands something softer lifting him. He opened his eyes and saw nothing but the bioluminescent glow of the forest. It was as if the jungle itself was alive, breathing, pulsating with energy. He wasn't alone. He felt something, or someone, watching over him, guiding him toward some unknown fate. Then, darkness. When he woke again, he wasn't the same man. In fact, he wasn't a man at all. Ethan's eyes flickered open, and immediately, something felt a broken bar off. His body was different, larger, more powerful. His muscles didn't ache like before, his vision sharper, and the air tasted a broken bar purer. Slowly, he lifted his hands, and a wave of confusion and panic hit him. These weren't his hands. They were larger, covered in a smooth, blue hue. Navy hands. His breath caught in his throat, and he sat up, examining his new body. His legs were healed, his senses heightened. He wasn't human anymore. He had been reborn as a Navy. For a brief moment, there was only confusion, but then the memories flooded back. The human military had left him to die, but it seemed they couldn't quite let him go. Some part of him had been saved, experimented on, and transferred into this Navi body as part of the Avatar project. It was supposed to be a mission and infiltration, but something had gone wrong. This wasn't just a disguise or a puppet controlled by his human mind. He felt alive in this body, more connected to Pandora than he had ever imagined. And with that connection came an overwhelming sense of anger, betrayal. He had been abandoned once before, and now he had the chance to return, and not as a man, but as something far more dangerous. As Ethan adjusted to his new form, he found himself among a Navi clan, learning their ways and customs. At first, he was wary, unsure of how much of his humanity remained and how much was consumed by the Navi spirit. But there was one who helped him bridge the gap between the two worlds: Tsalia, a Navi warrior who had grown curious about him. She had seen the pain in his eyes, the flicker of something that made him different from her people, and she had chosen to teach him. Tsalia, Ethan called to her one evening as they sat by a fire, the jungle humming around them. "Why do you help me?" She turned to him, her eyes glowing in the low light. "Because you are not like the others. The sky people, they come to take you a broken bar, you are torn." Ethan clenched his fists, feeling the strength of his Navi body surge with frustration. "They abandoned me, left me to die." "I should have died, yet you live," she said simply. "Pandora chose you." He looked into her eyes, trying to understand. The Navi believed in Iwa, the spiritual force that connected all life on the planet. But Ethan wasn't Navi, not really. He was human, or at least he had been. Now, he was something in between, and the anger that burned inside him was a very human emotion. "You speak of Iwa like she has a plan," Ethan said, his voice hard. "But what about revenge? What about justice?" Sally looked away, her expression unreadable. "Revenge will not bring peace. You must choose your path carefully, or you will lose yourself to the darkness." Ethan didn't respond. He had already lost too much. What was one more piece of his soul in exchange for retribution? As days turned into weeks, Ethan honed his skills. Tsalia taught him the ways of the Navi, how to move silently through the jungle, how to fight with their weapons, and how to listen to the whispers of the planet itself. But even as he learned, his mind was consumed by thoughts of revenge. He had heard rumors of a new human convoy moving through the jungle, led by Colonel Stark, the man who had ordered his abandonment. It was the chance Ethan had been waiting for. The night before the attack, Tsalia approached him. "You are not ready for this," she said, her voice filled with concern. Ethan shook his head. "I have to do this. They need to pay." Tsalia stepped closer, her eyes searching his. "And what will you become after you destroy them? You think this will make you whole again, but it will only shatter what remains." Ethan clenched his jaw, refusing to listen. He couldn't stop now. He had come too far. "Stay out of my way," he said coldly, turning away from her. That night, Ethan led a small group of Navi warriors on a covert mission to intercept the human convoy. They moved like shadows through the dense jungle, their footsteps silent, their weapons sharp. The convoy was unaware of the danger closing in on them. As they approached the convoy, Ethan's heart pounded with anticipation. His hands gripped the Navi bow tightly, and his eyes locked onto the figure of Colonel Stark, standing near one of the vehicles, barking orders at his men. The sight of the man who had condemned him to die ignited a fire in Ethan's chest, and for a moment, he saw nothing but the opportunity for vengeance. The attack was swift and brutal. Ethan's knowledge of human tactics gave the Navi the advantage, and they quickly overwhelmed the convoy's defenses. Explosions lit up the night sky, and the jungle echoed with the sounds of battle. Ethan moved with precision, taking down soldiers one by one, his mind focused solely on reaching Stark. Finally, he stood face to face with the colonel. "Cross?" Stark's voice was filled with disbelief. "You a broken bar? I thought you were dead." Ethan's eyes narrowed, his Navi body towering over the man who had once held his life in his hands. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Stark sneered, his face twisted in arrogance. "You were just another expendable asset, Cross." "You knew the risks." Ethan raised his weapon, his hands trembling with rage. "And now you'll pay for it." Before Stark could react, Ethan released the arrow, and it struck the colonel in the chest. Stark's eyes widened in shock, and he fell to the ground, blood pooling around him. But even as Ethan watched the life drain from his former commander, there was no sense of satisfaction, no relief. Instead, there was a hollow emptiness. As the battle raged on around him, Ethan stood frozen, staring down at Stark's lifeless body. He had gotten his revenge, but the price felt far steeper than he had anticipated. Suddenly, the ground beneath him seemed to tremble, and the jungle around him shifted, as if Pandora itself was reacting to his actions. He felt a strange energy coursing through his body, something far more powerful and dangerous than he had ever experienced before. It was as if Pandora was feeding on his anger, his hatred, amplifying it. For the first time since his transformation, Ethan felt fear. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as the ground continued to rumble beneath him, the jungle around him alive with a fury he didn't understand. His mind swirled with confusion and dread, and it wasn't just the aftermath of the battle or the weight of the revenge he had sought. It was something deeper, something ancient that had awoken within him. Pandora had reacted to his actions. It was no longer just the lush, mysterious world he had once known. It was as if the planet itself had a will, a consciousness, and it had been waiting for a moment like this. His vengeance, his hatred, that they were fueling something far darker, something he wasn't prepared to face. As he stood frozen, the Na'vi warriors around him regrouped, their voices low with concern. Sally approached, her gaze sharp and wary. She didn't speak immediately, but Ethan could see the disappointment in her eyes. She had warned him, tried to steer him away from this path, but he hadn't listened. "Ethan," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the distant cries of battle. "Pandora is responding to you. You need to stop before it's too late." He shook his head, trying to make sense of it all. His body felt heavy, like the energy of the planet itself was seeping into his veins. "I don't understand. What's happening?" "You've taken life out of hatred, out of vengeance. Pandora's energy flows through all living things, and when you disrupt that balance, it pushes back. It's not just about Iwa's will. The planet has power of its own, and it's feeding off what you've done." Ethan clenched his fists, the tension coiling inside him like a spring ready to snap. He didn't want to believe her. This was just a planet, a resource-rich world the humans had come to exploit. But everything he'd experienced since waking up in this Na'vi body said otherwise. The visions, the dreams, they weren't just figments of his imagination. Pandora was alive in a way he had never thought possible. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice rough. "I didn't ask for any of it." Sally stepped closer, her expression softening. "No one asks for war. But you chose vengeance, and now you must face the consequences." Ethan stared down at the lifeless body of Colonel Stark, the man who had set all of this in motion. His hatred for Stark had driven him here, driven him to betray the human race and embrace the Na'vi ways. But in doing so, he had unleashed something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. He had become the very thing he had once sworn to fight. He could feel Pandora's pull growing stronger, a deep, primal force tugging at his core, urging him to unleash more violence, more destruction. The rage inside him had been fed, but it wasn't satisfied. It wanted more. The planet's energy was entwining with his own, creating a dangerous symbiosis that was spiraling out of control. "I can't stop it," Ethan muttered, feeling the weight of it pressing down on him. Sally reached out and placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him for just a moment. "You can, you must, you have to let go of your anger, Ethan. If you don't, Pandora will consume you." He wanted to believe her, but the power was intoxicating. It flowed through him like fire, urging him to continue the fight, to wipe out every human who had wronged him. But deep down, he knew Tsalia was right. He was on the edge of something terrible, something irreversible. But how could he let go? After everything that had been taken from him, his life, his humanity, his purpose, how could he just forgive and move on? His thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of engines, human reinforcements. He looked up to see the sky filling with military craft, more of the human army descending to Pandora. They were coming to finish the job, to destroy the Na'vi once and for all, and they would kill him too if they realized what he had become. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, his final chance to choose either revenge or redemption. He could feel Pandora urging him to strike, to wipe out the human invaders and protect the planet. But that wasn't what Salia was asking of him. She was asking him to let go, to find another way, to protect without destroying. He looked into her eyes, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Salia squeezed his arm gently. "We fight to protect, not to destroy. You have the power to stop this, but you have to make the choice." The engines grew louder, and Ethan's pulse quickened. He could feel the pull of Pandora's energy urging him toward violence, but he fought against it, resisting the urge to let his anger consume him. With a deep breath, he stepped away from Salia and turned to face the incoming forces. The Na'vi around him were ready for battle, but Ethan knew that more bloodshed would only feed the darkness inside him, the darkness that Pandora seemed so eager to cultivate. He closed his eyes and focused on the connection he felt to the planet, to the life force that ran through every tree, every animal, every Na'vi. It was a web of energy, delicate yet powerful, and he was part of it now, whether he liked it or not. He couldn't destroy it. He had to protect it. As the first wave of human forces descended, Ethan raised his hands, not in violence, but in surrender. He opened himself to the energy of Pandora, letting it flow through him, not as a weapon, but as a shield. The ground trembled again, but this time, it wasn't out of anger. It was as if the planet was responding to his decision, to his choice to protect rather than destroy. The human soldiers, confused by the lack of resistance, hesitated. The Na'vi, following Ethan's lead, didn't attack. Instead, they stood their ground, watching as the humans approached. Ethan could feel the tension in the air, the uncertainty on both sides. But then, something unexpected happened. The ground beneath the human soldiers shifted, and massive roots began to rise from the earth, not to crush them, but to create a barrier between the humans and the Na'vi. The soldiers stumbled back, fear in their eyes as the jungle itself seemed to come alive, forming a protective wall around the Na'vi warriors. Ethan could feel the power of Pandora coursing through him, but it wasn't driven by anger or hatred anymore. It was a force of nature, a defense mechanism to protect the planet and its people. The humans hesitated, their weapons trained on the Na'vi, but they didn't fire. They were unsure, unprepared for this kind of resistance. Ethan stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Leave," he said. "There's nothing for you here. Go back to your ships. This planet is not yours to take." For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the human commander, clearly confused by the turn of events, gave the order to withdraw. One by one, the soldiers backed away, retreating to their transports. The engines roared to life, and within minutes, they were gone, leaving the Na'vi and Pandora untouched. As the last of the ships disappeared into the sky, Ethan collapsed to his knees, the weight of what he had just done hitting him all at once. He had stopped the violence, chosen a path of protection rather than destruction. But it had come at a cost. Salia knelt beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "You did it," she said softly. "You chose the right path." Ethan nodded, but the emptiness inside him remained. He had spared the humans, but his quest for revenge had left a scar on his soul that would never fully heal. He had become something different now, not entirely human, not fully Na'vi. He was a man caught between two worlds, neither of which he truly belonged to. As he gazed out at the jungle, the glow of Pandora's bioluminescent plants flickering in the distance, Ethan knew that his journey wasn't over. He had made his choice, but the path ahead was still uncertain. The planet had spared him, given him a second chance. But what he did with the chance would determine the fate of both the Na'vi and the humans who sought to control Pandora's power. For now, he would protect this world, even if it meant sacrificing the last remnants of his humanity. And as the night deepened and the jungle hummed with life, Ethan felt, for the first time in a long while, a sense of peace. He had let go of his anger, of his need for revenge. But in doing so, he had become something greater, something that Pandora itself had embraced. The soul of vengeance had been replaced by the spirit of a protector. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The jungle of Pandora was alive, teeming with colors that danced under the radiant sunlight filtering through the towering trees. Ethan moved silently, his feet barely touching the ground, his eyes scanning the vibrant world around him. Every leaf, every creature in Pandora's ecosystem pulsed with life. This was his home, this was what he had sworn to protect, no matter the cost. Yet, the balance of his world was changing. The interstellar bridge, the portal between Earth and Pandora, had been completed, a marvel of technology. It allowed instantaneous travel between the two worlds, a feat that was once unthinkable. Ethan stood at the edge of the sacred grove, gazing up at the massive structure, its metallic frame gleaming unnaturally against the organic beauty of Pandora. It was not the bridge itself that troubled him, it was what it represented. The humans, once adversaries of the Na'vi, had returned under the guise of peace, promising collaboration and the sharing of knowledge. But Ethan knew better than to trust easily. He had learned from his elders and from the painful history between their peoples. The scars left by human greed, driven by their lust for unobtainium, were still fresh. Today, Ethan was meeting with the human delegation. His mentor, Tsidi, had urged him to be cautious, to keep the humans at arm's length. Yet, Ethan was not convinced. As the newly appointed leader of the Omadikaya clan, he felt the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. His people needed him to be both a protector and a diplomat. He could not afford to make mistakes. The meeting took place near the base of the interstellar bridge. The humans had set up a small encampment, temporary but intrusive against the natural landscape. Dr. Grace, a scientist who had long advocated for Pandora's preservation, was there to greet him. Ethan, she began, her voice gentle but filled with the urgency of a scientist excited by new discoveries. We've made significant progress. The portal is stable, but we've detected some anomalies. Nothing too dangerous yet, but we need to investigate. Ethan's blue eyes narrowed. Anomalies? What kind of anomalies, Grace? She hesitated, glancing at her fellow scientists. We think we think there might be something or someone trying to use the portal from the outside. Ethan's heart quickened. His instincts flared. Who? We're not sure yet, but there have been signals. Disturbances from distant parts of the galaxy. Civilizations we've never encountered. The jungle around them suddenly felt more dangerous, as if it was holding its breath. Ethan exchanged a glance with Tsidi, who stood silently behind him. The elder's face was grim, his distrust of the humans clear. The portal was supposed to be a bridge of peace, Ethan said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Not an invitation for invasion. Grace nodded. We're working on it. But we need more time. We need your help to ensure Pandora's safety. The word safety echoed in his mind. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the dangers were already at their doorstep. As night fell, the jungle's colors dimmed, replaced by the soft glow of bioluminescence. Ethan sat by the fire, his thoughts racing. Could he trust the humans to fix what they had started? And what of the other worlds, the ones beyond the stars? The next morning, the first signs of trouble appeared. Small outposts on the outskirts of Na'vi territory reported strange sightings of unfamiliar ships hovering in the sky, their shapes unlike any the Na'vi had ever seen. Ethan immediately called for a council meeting. They have come, Tsidi said bluntly, his voice carrying an edge of bitterness. "The portal has brought them to us," Idak nodded. He had sensed this day would come, but he hadn't expected it so soon. "Who are they?" asked Neytiri, one of the clan's fiercest warriors and a close friend of Idakn. "What do they want?" Idakn's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "Power, control," just as the humans once did. The Navi were not a warlike people, but they were not defenseless either. Their bond with Iwa, the living force that connected all things on Pandora, was their greatest strength. But against an enemy they did not yet understand, would that be enough? The next few days passed in a haze of tension. Idakn prepared his people, fortifying their villages and teaching them how to use the environment to their advantage. The Navi could hide in the trees, move silently through the jungle, and strike from the shadows. They were a part of Pandora, and that connection made them strong. Then came the first attack. It was swift and brutal. The aliens, members of the Tarkolian Confederation, struck at the heart of a Navi village, their weapons unlike anything Idakn had seen. Towering machines, almost like the Mechs the humans had once used, but sleeker, faster, and far more deadly. They cut through the jungle with terrifying precision, destroying homes and killing Navi who tried to defend their territory. Idakn fought with everything he had, his arrows finding their marks, but it wasn't enough. The Tarkolians were too advanced, too overwhelming. As the village burned, he retreated, ordering his people to fall back into the deeper parts of the jungle. In the aftermath, Idakn sat with his people, feeling the weight of their losses. City was beside him, his face hard but unreadable. "We cannot fight them head on," Idakn said quietly, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "Their technology is too advanced." City nodded grimly. "We must use the jungle. We must fight as we always have by becoming the jungle itself." But Idakn knew that even their ancient ways might not be enough this time. They needed more, and that's when the idea struck him that perhaps the humans, with their knowledge and their technology, could be of use. It was a thought that unsettled him, but he knew he had no choice. If Pandora was to survive, they would need to forge new alliances, even if it meant trusting those who had once betrayed them. He called for a meeting with Dr. Grace and her team. They were hesitant at first, unsure of how to integrate their technology with the Navi's natural defenses. But Idakn was determined. "We must work together," he said, his voice firm. "We must combine what we know with what you know." Dr. Grace nodded slowly. "We can create hybrid defenses using human tech but in harmony with Pandora's environment. It'll be risky, but it might just work." The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. Idakn led his people in preparing for war, blending human technology with Navi tactics. They set traps, created ambush points, and built new weapons that combined the precision of human engineering with the strength of Pandora's natural resources. The jungle became a living fortress, every tree and creature a part of their strategy. Then came the final battle. The Tarkolians, confident in their superiority, launched a full-scale assault. Their ships darkened the sky, and their machines tore through the jungle with reckless abandon. But the Navi were ready. Idakn led the charge, riding on the back of a banshee, his bow in hand, as his warriors attacked from the skies and the trees. The Tarkolians, caught off guard by the Navi's newfound strength, faltered. The humans, too, played their part, using drones and advanced weaponry to provide cover and disrupt the enemy's communications. In the midst of the chaos, Idakn found himself face to face with Lord Vaxar, the Tarkolian leader. Vaxar was a towering figure, encased in sleek, alien armor, his eyes burning with arrogance. "You are a primitive people," Vaxar sneered. "You do not deserve this planet." Idakn's grip tightened on his bow. "Pandora is not yours to take." "You are a primitive people," Vaxar sneered. "You do not deserve this planet." Idakn's grip tightened on his bow. "Pandora is not yours to take." Vaxar raised his massive weapon, an alien construct pulsing with energy, a symbol of the superior technology his kind wielded without mercy. He towered over Idakn, confident in his dominance, his armor glinting menacingly under Pandora's strange light. "You fight for a lost cause," Vaxer continued, his voice dripping with disdain. Your people are doomed, and your planet will become just another resource to fuel the Tarkalian Empire. Idokun remained silent, his eyes narrowing as he calculated his next move. He could feel the energy of Iwa, the spirit of Pandora, coursing through him, guiding him, giving him strength. Vaxer might have had the upper hand in terms of technology, but Idokun knew that Pandora itself was a force far greater than any machine. The jungle, the creatures, and the spirit of the planet would fight with him. In one swift motion, Idokun launched himself into the air, using the strength of his legs and the agility of the Navi to propel himself onto a nearby tree branch. Vaxer fired his weapon, but Idokun was already gone, moving like a shadow through the trees, his bow at the ready. From his vantage point, Idokun loosed a flurry of arrows, each one striking with precision. Vaxer's armor deflected most of them, but one found a weak spot, piercing his shoulder. The alien let out a roar of pain, momentarily disoriented. You fight like a coward, Vaxer bellowed, clutching his wound. Face me, Navi, or are you too afraid? Idokun's voice was calm, almost serene. You are the one who should fear. This is not just a fight for land. This is a fight for life itself. With that, the jungle came alive around them. Idokun had called upon the creatures of Pandora, and they responded. A pack of Thanators, the fierce, six-legged predators of the jungle, burst from the undergrowth, their eyes glowing with an eerie intensity. They descended upon Vaxer, forcing him to defend himself as they circled, snarling and snapping at his limbs. Idokun took advantage of the distraction, moving quickly through the trees, using the high ground to keep himself out of Vaxer's line of sight. His people had joined the battle as well, striking from the shadows, blending in with the forest. The Tarkalians, despite their advanced weapons, were finding it increasingly difficult to keep up. The Navi knew their terrain, and they knew how to fight in harmony with it. But Vaxer was not defeated so easily. With a brutal swing of his weapon, he sent two of the Thanators crashing into the trees, their bodies hitting the ground with a sickening thud. He turned, his eyes burning with fury, searching for Idokun. I will burn this jungle to the ground. Vaxer snarled. Your primitive magic is no match for the power of the Empire. Idokun leapt from the trees, landing just behind Vaxer with a fluid grace that belied the tension of the battle. Before Vaxer could react, Idokun grabbed a vine, using it to swing around and strike the alien leader squarely in the chest. The impact knocked Vaxer back, his weapon flying from his hand as he stumbled to regain his footing. But Idokun didn't stop. He pressed the advantage, delivering a series of rapid strikes, each one finding its mark. Vaxer, for all his bluster, was not used to fighting an opponent who moved like the wind, who struck with the precision of a trained hunter. Each time Vaxer tried to counter, Idokun was already gone, his movements too fast, too fluid. With a final, powerful strike, Idokun drove an arrow into the joint of Vaxer's armor, just beneath his arm. Vaxer let out a roar of pain as he fell to one knee, his hand clutching the wound. Blood thick and dark poured from the injury, staining the ground beneath him. This is the power of Pandora, Idokun said, his voice low and commanding. You do not belong here. Vaxer looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and disbelief. He had underestimated these primitive people. He had thought his technology would be enough to crush them, but he had failed to understand the true power of the Navia, their connection to their world, to each other, and to something far greater than any empire. As Vaxer fell, defeated, Idokun stood tall, his bow lowered but still ready. The battle was far from over, but this victory was a turning point. The Tarkalian forces, seeing their leader fall, began to retreat, their morale shattered. The Navi, emboldened by Idokun's leadership, pressed the attack, driving the invaders back toward their ships. Idokun watched as the alien ships lifted off, disappearing into the sky. For now, Pandora was safe. But he knew this would not be the last time they would face threats from beyond the stars. Dr. Grace and her team emerged from the jungle, looking battered but alive. She approached Idokun, her face filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "You did it," she said, her voice soft. Iduk nodded, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "For now," Grace sighed, wiping the sweat from her brow. "We'll need to make sure they don't come back. We need to strengthen the defenses. Make sure the bridge is guarded." Iduk turned to face her. "The bridge is a gateway. It brings both good and bad. We must be careful with how we use it." Grace nodded in agreement. "We'll figure it out together." The humans had proven their loyalty, at least for now. But Iduk knew that the balance was delicate. The humans had technology, but the Navi had something far more powerful: Iwa, the life force of Pandora. He would not forget that, and he would make sure that his people never lost sight of it either. In the days that followed, Pandora began to heal. The jungle, resilient and alive, started to reclaim the scars left by the Tarkalians. The Navi mourned their losses, but they also celebrated their victory. They had fought not just for themselves, but for their planet, for the life that thrived on Pandora. Iduk stood once more at the edge of the sacred grove, looking up at the interstellar bridge. The portal shimmered in the distance, a symbol of both hope and danger. It had brought new friends, but it had also brought enemies. As the night fell and the jungle around him began to glow with its bioluminescent beauty, Iduk closed his eyes and breathed deeply. He could feel Iwa's presence, guiding him, comforting him. Pandora was his home, and he would protect it with everything he had. For now, the Tarkalians were gone, but Iduk knew that other threats would come. The galaxy was vast, filled with civilizations that would see Pandora as a prize to be taken. But as long as he lived, as long as the Navi remained connected to their world, they would stand strong. Pandora was not just a place, it was a living, breathing entity. It was a bridge between worlds, between cultures, between life and death. And as Iduk looked out over the jungle, he knew that the real battle had only just begun. But he was ready. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The air was thick with the scent of Pandora's dense jungle, the leaves vibrant with life, rustling gently as if whispering to one another. Tara stood still, the warmth of the soil seeping through her bare feet, grounding her to the earth. She gazed up at the towering tree of souls, its bioluminescent tendrils glowing faintly in the dimming light. To her people, this tree was more than a sacred monument. It was the heart of their connection to Iwa, the all-encompassing spirit of Pandora. But today, that connection felt fragile, on the brink of being severed forever. In the distance, she heard the low hum of human machines. The sound was a constant reminder that the balance of Pandora was no longer in Navi hands alone. Since their arrival, the humans had burrowed deep into the land, laying down research stations, drilling machines, and data-gathering drones. Tara had once thought that by working with them, she could ensure that both her people and the humans could share this world in harmony. She had believed that understanding their science would help protect Pandora. But now, after the latest catastrophe, she wasn't so sure. "Do you feel it?" Loken's voice came from behind her, deep and filled with resentment. The young warrior had approached her quietly, his presence as fierce as the storm that brewed in his heart. Tara turned to face him, his blue skin and piercing amber eyes nearly blending into the forest around them. He was taller than her, broad-shouldered and carrying the weight of their people's anger on his back. "I feel it," Tara said softly. She didn't need to ask what he meant. Every Navi could feel the growing unease in the air, as if the land itself was crying out for relief from the humans' interference. The recent accident and explosion near the Tree of Souls had shaken everyone. Though the humans claimed it was an accident, Loken and his followers saw it as a declaration of war. "Yet, you still stand with them," Loken spat, stepping closer, his voice low but seething. "You work in their labs, watch them tear apart our world, and do nothing." Tara's heart clenched. It wasn't as simple as Loken believed. "I'm trying to find a way to stop this without bloodshed. If we attack them, if we start a war, the humans will retaliate, and they have the technology to destroy us. All of us." Loken's nostrils flared, his gaze hardening. "We can't let them continue. The humans only take, never giving back. They desecrate our home with their machines, their experiments. We must act, or we'll lose everything." Tara wanted to argue, to plead with him to see reason, but she knew it was futile. Loken had already made up his mind, and his anger was shared by many of their people. They were ready for rebellion. The young Na'vi leader believed that only force would make the humans leave, and every day more joined his cause. "I've seen what they're planning," Loken said, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "Their new energy system will drain the life from this world, starting with the Tree of Souls. You know this, Tara. You've seen their machines." Her stomach twisted. She had seen them. The humans' energy project was more dangerous than they let on. While the official reports claimed the research was meant to find clean energy solutions for both humans and Na'vi, Tara knew that the corporation funding the project had darker intentions. They sought to extract Pandora's energy for their own gain, with little regard for the consequences to the planet's delicate ecosystem. "You could help us," Loken urged, his tone softening, trying to appeal to her one last time. "With your knowledge, we could stop them. Together, we could protect our home." Tara closed her eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She was Na'vi, but she had spent so much time among the humans, working in their labs, learning their ways. She believed in peaceful solutions, but with each passing day, it seemed that peace was slipping further from reach. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not like this." Loken's expression darkened. He stepped back, his jaw set in determination. "Then you've chosen your side." Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the dense foliage, leaving Tara alone with her thoughts. She stood there for a long time, staring at the Tree of Souls, wondering if she had made the right choice. Back at the human research facility, Tara felt the cold sterility of the lab settle over her like a suffocating blanket. The sharp hum of machines and the sterile scent of disinfectant replaced the rich, earthy smells of Pandora's forests. She walked through the brightly lit corridors, her blue skin and traditional Na'vi clothing stark against the white walls and metallic surfaces. Dr. Carter, the head of the research project, was waiting for her in the control room. He was a tall, thin man with graying hair and an intense gaze that seemed permanently fixed in deep contemplation. He looked up from his data screen as she entered, a brief smile flashing across his face. "Tara, glad you're here," he said, standing up and motioning her to sit. "We've made some progress on the energy system. I think we're close to a breakthrough." Tara forced a smile, sitting down opposite him. She had once admired Dr. Carter's dedication to science, but now, knowing what she did about the real purpose of the energy project, she found it hard to share his enthusiasm. "That's good to hear," she said, her voice steady. "But there's still concern among the Na'vi. The accident near the Tree of Souls has caused a lot of unrest. People are scared, and some of them are talking about taking drastic measures." Dr. Carter's expression darkened slightly, and he sighed. "I understand their concerns, but I assure you, the accident was just that, an accident. We're doing everything we can to prevent any further damage to Pandora's ecosystem." Tara's fist clenched in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to believe him, but the more she learned, the more she realized that the humans' plans went far beyond simple scientific research. They were after something much more dangerous, something that could destroy her world. "I hope you're right," Tara said quietly. "Because if you're not, there will be consequences. The Na'vi won't stand by and watch their home be destroyed." Dr. Carter leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I hope it doesn't come to that. We're here to help, Tara, not to destroy." "You've been working with us for years, so you know that better than anyone." Did she? Tara wasn't so sure anymore. She had spent so much time trying to mediate between the two sides, hoping to find a solution that would benefit both the Na'vi and the humans. But now, it felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, with no clear path forward. "I just want to make sure we don't cross a line we can't come back from," Tara said softly, her gaze dropping to the floor. Dr. Carter nodded, though there was a hint of impatience in his eyes. We won't. Trust me. Trust, that was the word that hung in the air between them, fragile and uncertain. Tara stood up, unable to stay any longer. I'll see you tomorrow. As she left the lab, her mind raced. Loken's words echoed in her head. He wasn't wrong. If the humans activated their energy system, the damage could be catastrophic. But starting a war wasn't the answer either. There had to be another way. She just needed to find it. That night, Tara couldn't sleep. She lay in her hammock, listening to the sounds of the jungle outside her window. The leaves rustled in the breeze, the distant calls of creatures echoed through the trees, and the soft glow of the bioluminescent plants illuminated her room. But all she could think about was the ticking clock. Time was running out. Loken's followers were growing more restless by the day, and the humans were pushing forward with their project. Just as she was about to drift into a restless sleep, there was a soft knock on her door. She sat up, heart racing, and opened it to find Ethan, a human engineer she had grown close to over the years. He was one of the few humans who seemed to truly respect the Na'vi and their way of life. Ethan, she whispered, stepping aside to let him in. What are you doing here? He looked around nervously before stepping inside and closing the door. I had to talk to you. I overheard something today. Something you need to know. Tara's heart pounded in her chest. What is it? Ethan glanced out the window, as if checking for eavesdroppers, before speaking in a low voice. The corporation funding the research at this energy project isn't what they say it is. It's not about finding clean energy. They're planning to use Pandora's resources for their own gain, and they don't care about the consequences. Tara felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. What are they planning to do? They're going to activate the system soon, and once it's running, it'll drain the life from the Tree of Souls. It'll kill Pandora. Tara, her hands trembled as she processed the information. This was worse than she had imagined. If they activated that system, everything she had fought for would be lost. Everything her people held sacred would be destroyed. We have to stop them, Ethan said, his voice urgent. I can help you shut it down, but we need to act fast. There's not much time. Tara looked at him, her mind racing. Could she trust him? He had always been an ally, but this was different. This was life or death, for both her people and his. I'll help you, she said finally. But we need to be careful. Loken and his followers are already planning something. If they attack, it could lead to a full-scale war. Ethan nodded, his expression grim. We'll stop them, together. As they began to plan their next move, Tara couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking a dangerous line. One wrong step, and everything could fall apart. But she had no choice. If she didn't act, Pandora would be lost forever. The next morning, the air was thick with tension. Tara could feel it in her bones as she made her way through the jungle, her thoughts consumed by the plan she and Ethan had devised the night before. The sun was barely up, but she knew Loken and his followers were already preparing for their assault. Time was running out. As she approached the human research facility, she saw Ethan waiting for her near the entrance. His expression was grim, his eyes dark with worry. He gave her a brief nod as she joined him. You ready? He asked quietly. Tara took a deep breath, nodding. As ready as I'll ever be. They slipped into the facility unnoticed, making their way to the lower levels where the experimental energy system was housed. The hum of machines and the sterile smell of the lab were familiar, but today they felt oppressive, like the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. Ethan led the way, using his security clearance to bypass locked doors and restricted areas. Tara followed closely behind, her heart pounding in her chest. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. They reached the control room without incident, but as they stepped inside, they found Dr. Carter already there, staring at the console with a troubled expression. He turned as they entered, his face hardening when he saw Tara and Ethan. What are you doing here? He demanded, his voice cold. Tara stepped forward, her gaze steady. "We're here to stop you. We know what the energy system is really for." Dr. Carter's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand. This project is bigger than any one of us. It's about securing a future for humanity." "At the expense of Pandora?" Tara shot back. "At the expense of my people?" Dr. Carter sighed, shaking his head. "You're being short-sighted. The energy we can harness here could save millions of lives. It could power entire cities, revolutionize technology, and destroy everything we hold sacred." Tara interrupted. "You'll kill the Tree of Souls, drain the life from this planet, and for what? Human greed?" Ethan stepped forward, his voice firm. "We can find another way, Dr. Carter. We don't have to destroy Pandora to save humanity." For a moment, Dr. Carter seemed to hesitate, his eyes flicking between Tara and Ethan. But then his jaw tightened, and he shook his head. "You're too late. The system is already operational. There's nothing you can do." Panic surged in Tara's chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. "We can shut it down," she said, her voice steady. "We have to." Dr. Carter stepped in front of the console, blocking their path. "I can't let you do that." Without warning, Ethan lunged forward, grabbing Dr. Carter's arm and pulling him away from the console. The two men struggled briefly, but Ethan was younger and stronger, quickly overpowering the older scientist. "Tara, now!" Ethan shouted, holding Dr. Carter back as Tara rushed to the console. Her hands trembled as she began to work, navigating through the complex interface. She had spent enough time in the lab to understand how the system worked, but disabling it was another matter entirely. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she frantically entered commands, trying to shut down the energy transfer before it reached critical levels. Behind her, she heard the scuffle of feet and the sound of Dr. Carter's labored breathing as he struggled against Ethan's grip. Time was running out. Finally, with a sharp beep, the console flashed red, and the hum of the machines began to die down. Tara's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the energy levels drop, the system slowly winding down. But just as she was about to breathe a sigh of relief, an alarm blared through the facility. A warning flashed on the console: "System failure. Emergency shutdown required." "What's happening?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with fear. Tara's hands flew over the controls, trying to make sense of the warning. "The system is destabilizing," she said, her voice shaky. "If we don't shut it down manually, it could cause an explosion." Dr. Carter let out a low laugh, his voice laced with bitterness. "You don't know what you're doing. If you disable the system now, it'll take out half the facility, maybe more." Tara's heart sank. She had to make a choice: let the system run its course and risk the destruction of Pandora, or disable it and potentially cause a catastrophic explosion. Ethan glanced at her, his eyes filled with determination. "Do it." "We can't let them destroy the Tree of Souls." Tara nodded, her hands steady as she entered the final command. The system's hum grew louder for a moment, and then everything went silent. For a heartbeat, it felt like the world had stopped. And then the ground shook. The lights flickered, and the sound of machinery grinding to a halt filled the air. The walls trembled, dust and debris falling from the ceiling as the facility began to collapse in on itself. "Run!" Ethan shouted, pulling Tara toward the door. They sprinted through the collapsing corridors, the ground shaking beneath their feet. Tara's lungs burned as she ran, her heart pounding in her ears. She could hear the distant sound of explosions, the facility tearing itself apart as the energy system imploded. They burst out of the facility just as the final explosion rocked the ground, sending a plume of smoke and fire into the air. Tara stumbled, her legs shaking, but Ethan caught her, steadying her as they watched the facility burn. For a moment, there was only the sound of the fire crackling and the distant hum of the jungle. And then, slowly, the sounds of Pandora began to return: the soft rustle of leaves, the distant calls of creatures, the gentle whisper of the wind. Tara's heart ached as she looked out at the burning wreckage of the facility. They had stopped the system, but at what cost? "We did it," Ethan said quietly, his voice filled with disbelief. "We actually did it." Tara nodded, but the victory felt hollow. The rebellion wasn't over. Loken and his followers would see this as a sign that war was inevitable, that the only way to protect Pandora was through violence. But as she stood there, watching the flames die down, she knew there had to be another way. She couldn't let her people be consumed by hatred and fear, just as she couldn't let the humans destroy their home. The path ahead was uncertain, but Tara was determined to find a way to bridge the gap between their worlds. The future of both the Navi and the humans depended on it. Several days passed before the dust finally settled. The rebellion had shaken both the Navi and the humans, but for now, a fragile peace had taken hold. The surviving humans had evacuated the planet, leaving behind only those like Ethan who had chosen to stay and help rebuild. Loken's forces had scattered after the destruction of the facility, but the threat of further violence still loomed over Pandora. Tara had managed to broker a temporary truce, convincing both sides to stand down for now. As she stood at the base of the Tree of Souls, the soft glow of its tendrils illuminating the night, she felt a flicker of hope. The balance of Pandora had been restored, at least for the time being. But she knew that true peace would take time and trust. Ethan joined her, his expression calm as he gazed up at the tree. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. Tara nodded. "It is. It's everything to us." Ethan was silent for a moment before he spoke again. "Do you think we'll ever really understand each other, humans and Navi?" Tara looked up at the tree, the light reflecting in her eyes. "I don't know, but I have to believe we can." Ethan smiled softly. "I believe it too." They stood together in the quiet of the night, the weight of their choices heavy on their shoulders. The future was uncertain, but for now, there was peace. And that was enough.